Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift back, way back, to a time of dragon-headed longships, icy seas, and the kind of grit that makes your average Monday morning feel like a spa day. We're peeling back the layers of legend to get to the very real, very human question of, what did Vikings actually eat on long voyages? Picture yourself on the deck of one of those magnificent vessels, the wind a living thing, whipping your hair, tasting of salt and distant, unknown lands. The gray waves of the North Atlantic stretch endlessly in every direction, and land? Land is a memory, or perhaps, a fervent hope. Now, imagine doing that for weeks, even months, with no GPS, no weather forecasts beyond what the oldest sailor can read in the clouds, and certainly no emergency rations airlifted by helicopter. Honestly, you probably wouldn't survive this for more than a few days, not with what they had on the menu. We've grown a little, accustomed to our comforts, haven't we? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel find other curious minds like yours. And while you're at it, pop your location and what time it is for you down in the comments. It's always fascinating to see where everyone's tuning in from. I see we've got night owls from New Zealand and early risers in Scandinavia itself. Absolutely brilliant. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Forget the horned helmets. They weren't really a thing for battle, and certainly not for dinner prep. Instead, focus on the gnawing, practical reality that faced every Viking crew before they even thought about hoisting sail. Food. Not just any food, but food that could withstand the relentless dam, the rocking of the ship, the passage of time, and the appetites of dozens of hardworking, often freezing, warriors and sailors. This wasn't a weekend camping trip where you could pop to the local store if you forgot the marshmallows. This was a commitment to the void, a journey into the vast unknown where the only guarantee was that you'd get hungry. Imagine the scene. It's not the glorious departure often depicted, with cheering crowds and unfurled banners. Think instead of the days, perhaps weeks, leading up to it. You're there, on a windswept shore in Norway, or Denmark. The air is sharp, carrying the scent of pine from the forests, the tang of the fjord, and the slightly acrid smell of smoke from 100 hearths. The longship, your new, somewhat claustrophobic home, is beached, its intricately carved prow pointing skyward like a patient beast. Around it, there's a controlled chaos. Barrels are being rolled, heavy sacks are being grunted onto shoulders, and there's a constant, low murmur of discussion, of lists being checked and rechecked, not on parchment, perhaps, but in the minds of seasoned planners. You see, the success of any Viking voyage, whether for raiding, trading, or exploration, hinged catastrophically on this very moment, the packing of provisions. You think meal prep for a week is tough? Try meal prep for 3 months on a wooden roller coaster with a leaky roof, for a crew that rows for hours and fights for their lives. Every single item had to earn its place. Space was at an absolute premium. This wasn't a cargo ship designed for bulk. It was a sleek, shallow draft vessel built for speed and surprise. So, every cask of water, every side of dried meat, every bag of grain was a calculated decision, a trade-off against something else that might be useful, or, indeed, essential. What would you prioritize? Water, of course. Without it, you're done for in days. But water is heavy, takes up space, and can go foul. Then calories. Dense, long-lasting calories. Forget fresh fruit and veg. That's a pipe dream unless you plan on very short coastal hops. You're thinking dried, salted, smoked, anything that promises to resist the inevitable assault of mold and decay. The very air on board would become thick with the smell of these preserved foods, the sharp, pungent aroma of dried fish, the smoky scent of cured hams, the earthy smell of root vegetables if you were lucky enough to have some that might last a short while. And who made these decisions? Was it the Jarl, the chieftain, pointing a lordly finger at various piles of stuff? Or was it a more collaborative effort, with experienced mariners and, crucially, the women of the household, who likely oversaw much of the food preservation, having the primary say? Historians still argue whether Vikings meticulously planned every single item based on caloric need, perhaps learning from generations of trial and error, or if there was a degree of hopeful overpacking, better have too much than too little philosophy, coupled with a strong reliance on raiding or foraging when opportunities arose. Given the stakes, a bit of both seems likely. Consider the sheer mental load. You're trying to calculate how much a large, active man will eat over an indeterminate period. Will the voyage be swift, blessed by fair winds? Or will you be becalmed for weeks, or battered by storms that drive you far off course, extending your journey and your dwindling supplies? The original "Are we there yet?" probably sounded a lot more like "Are we all going to starve yet?" It's a chilling thought to be adrift with the bottom of the food barrel becoming an increasingly visible and dreaded sight. One of the most well-documented aspects of Viking expansion is their voyages across the North Atlantic to settle Iceland and Greenland, and even reaching Vinland, in modern-day North America, around the year 1000 AD. These weren't short trips. The journey to Iceland could take a week or more in good conditions. To Greenland, significantly longer and through much more treacherous, ice-choked waters. And Vinland? That was a multi-stage journey over vast distances, likely taking months. The provisions for such undertakings had to be immense, and their selection incredibly astute. They weren't just packing for survival. They were packing to arrive with enough strength to build settlements, to explore, to live. Now, for a quirky little tidbit, amidst all this pragmatic packing of essentials, it's conceivable they might have included items less for their caloric value and more for, well, other reasons. Perhaps certain dried herbs or berries, known from folk medicine, were tucked away not just as a feigned hope for flavor, but as a charm against sickness or ill fortune at sea. Imagine a small leather pouch, tied securely, containing a handful of rowan berries, believed to ward off evil, or a specific dried mushroom that, while not particularly nutritious, was thought to grant keen eyesight for spotting land or danger. We don't have shipping manifests detailing one pouch of lucky heather, but in a world so intertwined with the supernatural, such small concessions to fate wouldn't be surprising. It speaks to the human need for comfort and control in situations that are overwhelmingly out of one's hands. The weight of the food, the barrels of ale or soured milk, the sacks of grain, it all had to be stowed carefully, not just to fit, but to maintain the balance and trim of the longship. A poorly loaded ship is an unstable ship, and in the unforgiving North Atlantic, instability was a death sentence. So, as you watch these provisions disappear into the shallow hull, beneath the rowing benches where you'll soon be spending countless, back-breaking hours, you feel a mixture of reassurance at the sheer volume, and a cold dread at the thought that, even this mountain of sustenance, might not be enough. We're not talking Michelin stars here, are we? More like Michelin tire if you're lucky kind of cuisine. The focus was pure, unadulterated fuel, with taste being a very distant, almost forgotten, luxury. The stark reality was that every mouthful was a step further from starvation, a small victory against the relentless indifference of the sea. And that, my friends, is where our story of Viking voyage victuals truly begins, with the monumental, life-or-death challenge of simply getting the larder packed. So, with the monumental task of gathering provisions somewhat under control, at least in theory, your attention now turns to the vessel itself. That magnificent, terrifyingly slender longship. It's not just a boat, it's your world, your larder, and your latrine, all rolled into one. And the design of this iconic Viking ship played an absolutely crucial role in dictating what kind of food could be carried, how much of it, and where it would go. You can't just chuck barrels in willy-nilly, not unless you fancy an impromptu swimming lesson in iceberg-infested waters. The typical Viking longship, whether it was a swift snegja, a versatile ske, or a broader cargo carrier known as a nar, which, incidentally, would have been more common for long-haul colonization or extensive trading voyages precisely because it could carry more, was characterized by its shallow draft, long narrow hull, and light construction. This design was genius for speed, for navigating shallow rivers and fjords, and for allowing ships to be beached easily for raids or repairs. But for storage, it presented a unique set of challenges. You don't have deep, cavernous holds like in later, larger sailing ships. Space was severely limited, both in terms of volume and how it was distributed. Think about it. The central part of the ship was largely open, dominated by the mast and the rowing benches. This is where the crew lived, worked, and slept, often under a simple tent-like canvas awning called a chald in bad weather. So, where do you put months' worth of food for, say, 30 to 60 hungry Vikings? The answer is, everywhere you possibly can, in a very organized fashion. Storage was often beneath the rowing benches themselves. These weren't comfy seats with underseat storage compartments like on a modern train. They were simple planks. But the space underneath, between the ship's ribs, could be utilized. Personal chests, or kista, containing a Viking's gear, weapons, clothes, maybe a few personal items, would also double as seats and storage, and sometimes, food might be integrated within or around these. The largest items, like barrels of water, ale, or soured milk, and sacks of grain, would likely be positioned centrally and low in the ship to act as ballast, helping with stability. This is a key historical fact. The placement of heavy goods was critical for the seaworthiness of these clinker-built vessels. If the weight was too high or unevenly distributed, the ship could become top-heavy and capsize, or handle poorly in rough seas. So, the heaviest food and drink supplies, the absolute essentials, were not just cargo. They were an integral part of the ship's balance. You can imagine experienced sailors meticulously overseeing this loading, knowing that a mistake here could doom them all before they even lost sight of land. The shape of the hull, curving inwards at the top, a feature known as tumblehome, though less pronounced in some Viking designs compared to later warships, also influenced what could be stored and how. Sacks might conform to the curve, but rigid barrels would leave awkward, unusable gaps if not carefully sized and placed. This is where you see the ingenuity of Viking craftsmanship, not just in shipbuilding, but in coopering, the making of barrels and casks. They would have had containers of various shapes and sizes, tailored to fit snugly into the nooks and crannies of the ship. Perhaps flatter, wider casks for liquids to sit lower, or specially shaped leather bags that could be squeezed into irregular spaces. And what about protection from the elements? A longship wasn't exactly a sealed environment. Even with the chald-rigged, sea spray, rain, and the general damp of the North Atlantic were constant companions. Food that was susceptible to moisture, like dried grains or flour, would need to be in well-sealed containers. This is where leather bags, perhaps treated with beeswax or pitch for waterproofing, and tightly lidded wooden chests or barrels, become vital. You can almost smell the tar and damp wool, a signature scent of any long voyage. Historians still argue whether the Vikings had truly mastered waterproof storage for bulk dry goods on long voyages, or if a certain level of spoilage was simply accepted as inevitable. Given the accounts of hardship, the latter seems plausible, with crews perhaps having to discard, or consume, less than ideal provisions. Now for a quirky tidbit. While we think of barrels for liquids, some scholars suggest that certain preserved foods, like butter or even some types of heavily salted meat, might have been packed inside animal hides or even stomachs, sewn up tightly. Think of it as an organic, biodegradable Ziploc bag, Viking style. It sounds a bit grim to us, perhaps, but it's a practical solution using readily available materials. Imagine a carefully prepared sheep's stomach, cleaned and treated, then stuffed with preserved meat or fat, sealed, and hung in a cool part of the ship. It's resourceful, if not exactly appealing to the modern palate. The Vikings were nothing if not masters of using every part of the animal. The very structure of the ship also dictated access. If you're in the middle of a storm, or even just heavy seas, clambering around to get to specific food stores would be difficult and dangerous. So, presumably, there was a system. Perhaps a certain amount of food for the next few days was kept in a more accessible location, with the bulk supplies stowed more securely and accessed less frequently. Maybe one or two designated crew members were responsible for provisions, the quartermasters, of their day, ensuring fair distribution and keeping track of dwindling stocks. You wouldn't want just anyone rummaging through the precious food supply, especially if things got desperate. That's a recipe for chaos and mutiny, faster than you can say. Ragnar was looking a bit too hungry at my share of the stockfish. Consider the gnar again. These were the workhorses, broader in the beam and with more dedicated cargo space, sometimes even a partially enclosed deck area. For voyages aimed at colonization, like those to Iceland or Greenland, where families and livestock were also transported, the Nar was essential. It could carry not just food for the humans, but also fodder for the animals, dried hay, for instance, which is bulky and prone to rot. The logistics of provisioning a Nar for such a journey, with live animals needing water and food, alongside the human passengers and crew, would have been an order of magnitude more complex than for a raiding longship. And yet they did it, repeatedly. It's a testament to their seafaring skills and their remarkable ability to plan for incredibly harsh conditions. The success of these settlements depended entirely on what they could bring with them, including the means to start producing their own food once they arrived. The ship, in this context, wasn't just a vehicle, it was an ark, carrying the seeds of a new society. So, as you settle onto your hard-rowing bench, your personal chest beneath you perhaps containing a small, carefully wrapped piece of dried meat you're saving for a special occasion, or a dire emergency, you are surrounded by the very means of your survival. The creak of the timbers, the slosh of water in the barrels below, the faint, mixed aroma of tar, salt, dried fish, and unwashed bodies. This is the sensory world shaped by the longship's larder. It's a world where every inch of space matters, and where the elegant lines of your vessel are not just for show, but a fundamental constraint on life itself. The ship is both your protector and your prison, and its ability to carry sustenance is the invisible thread upon which all their ambitious voyages hung. Next time you complain about not enough legroom on a flight, spare a thought for the Viking sailor trying to sleep next to a barrel of sour milk and a seasick sheep. Alright, so we've got our Viking longship, cleverly packed, we hope, with enough provisions to prevent imminent starvation. Now, let's delve into the actual menu. And at the very foundation of this seafaring diet, the bedrock of calories that kept those oars moving and swords swinging, were grains and, inevitably, hardtack. Not exactly the stuff of gourmet dreams, is it? More like the stuff of dental nightmares, but absolutely essential. You can picture it, sacks and well-sealed wooden chests filled with various types of grain. Barley was a common staple in Scandinavia, hardy and versatile. Oats too, and perhaps some rye. Wheat was less common in the harsher northern climates, but might have been acquired through trade or grown in more southerly Viking settlements. These grains wouldn't just be eaten whole, like some kind of penance, though I'm sure desperate times called for desperate measures. More likely, they were coarsely ground into flour or meal, either before the voyage or even on board, using small, portable hand mills called cornstones. Imagine the gritty, monotonous task of grinding grain on a swaying ship, dust flying, knuckles scraping. It's not exactly baking day with grandma. This flour or meal could then be used to make a variety of basic, if uninspiring, foods. Porridge or gruel would have been a common one, simple to make, just needing water and a heat source, which we'll get to, because cooking on a wooden ship is a whole other adventure. A warm, albeit bland, bowl of porridge might have been a small comfort on a cold, wet morning watch. It's the kind of basic sustenance that fills the belly and provides slow-release energy, crucial for the endurance-based tasks of sailing and rowing. But the real star of the carbohydrate show, the undisputed champion of long-lasting, indestructible travel food, was hardtack. Or, as it's variously known, ship's biscuit, sea bread, or, less flatteringly, molar breakers, and worm castles. This wasn't your fluffy, artisanal sourdough, my friend. This was a simple, unleavened bread or biscuit, made from flour, water, and maybe a bit of salt, baked multiple times until it was incredibly hard and dry. The goal was to remove as much moisture as possible, making it highly resistant to mold. We're talking about something so dense, it could probably be used as a defensive weapon in a pinch. Stand back, or I'll hit you with my breakfast. The historical fact here is that hardtack, in various forms, has been a staple for sailors and soldiers for centuries, long before and long after the Vikings. Its longevity was its primary virtue. Properly made and stored, it could last for months, even years. The downside? It was often incredibly hard to eat. You wouldn't typically bite into it directly unless you had an excellent relationship with your dentist, or no teeth left to worry about. More commonly, it would be soaked in whatever liquid was available: water, ale, broth, even coffee in later eras, to soften it up. You can imagine a Viking sailor, teeth gritted, dunking a piece of this unforgiving biscuit into his cup of weak ale, hoping it would eventually yield to something chewable. The taste? Well, bland would be a kindness. It was essentially flour and water, baked to within an inch of its life. Any flavor would likely come from whatever it was soaked in, or, less appetizingly, from whatever company it had been keeping in the storage sacks. Weevils and maggots were common companions in ship's biscuits and later naval traditions, and it's highly probable the Vikings faced similar unwelcome protein supplements. Sailors used to tap their hardtack on the table before eating it, not as a nervous habit, but to knock out the weevils. Yum! Makes you appreciate that slightly stale croissant you had this morning, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether Vikings baked their hardtack specifically for voyages and large, centralized efforts, or if individual households contributed to a communal store. Given the scale of some expeditions, some level of organized production seems likely. Perhaps villages with access to larger ovens or more grain specialized in producing these vital, if unloved, provisions. Now for a quirky tidbit. There's a story, possibly apocryphal but wonderfully illustrated, about a piece of hardtack from the English Civil War, much later than the Vikings, but the principle is the same, that was used as a doorstop for decades before someone realized what it was. That's how durable this stuff could be. You could probably build a small, rather unappetizing hut out of it. Vikings might not have used it for DIY projects, but its sheer indestructibility was its saving grace. Beyond hardtack and porridge, grains could also be used to make flatbreads, cooked on a hot stone or a griddle if they had the means to do so safely on board. These would have been a slight improvement, perhaps, especially if eaten relatively fresh. But again, the emphasis was on longevity. Any bread with moisture would succumb to mold very quickly in the damp conditions of a long ship. So, the drier and harder, the better, even if it meant your jaw got a serious workout at every meal. Consider also the psychological aspect. While this food was primarily fuel, the act of eating, even something as basic as gruel or hardtack, provided a small ritual, a break in the monotony and hardship of a long voyage. Sharing food, however meager, helps to bond a crew. Though, I imagine arguments over the least weevil-infested piece of hardtack were probably common. "Hey Bjorn, that's my worm castle. You had the one with only 3 maggots yesterday." These grains weren't just for the crew either. If they were transporting livestock, as they often did on colonization voyages, then grain or dried fodder would also be essential for keeping the animals alive until they reached their destination. So, the sacks of barley weren't just for human porridge. They were also ensuring the survival of the walking, bleeding, or clucking protein sources they were bringing with them. So, as you sit on your rowing bench, gnawing on a piece of hardtack that feels like it's fighting back, remember that this humble, unglamorous fare is what powered the Viking Age. It fueled the explorers who charted unknown seas, the warriors who terrified kingdoms, and the settlers who built new lives in harsh, unforgiving lands. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't tasty, but it was there. And in the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean, there was often the difference between life and death. Every gritty, hard-won mouthful was a testament to their resilience and their relentless drive to push beyond the horizon. You probably complained to TripAdvisor about the lack of gluten-free options, but for them, it was simply survival. Alright, so we've established that our Viking friends weren't exactly feasting on artisanal bread and delicate pastries. Their carbohydrate intake was robust, to put it mildly. But what about protein? You can't row across the Atlantic or swing a heavy axe on porridge alone. You need muscle fuel, and for the Vikings, a significant portion of that came from meat, specifically, meat on the hoof that had been ingeniously preserved to last the long, damp months at sea. Forget shrink-wrapped steaks from the supermarket. The Viking larder at sea would have featured a rather different kind of butcher's display. We're talking about dried, salted, and smoked meats, prepared with age-old techniques designed to halt decay and make the protein portable. The primary land animals contributing to this would have been those common to Scandinavian agriculture: cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs. Horses, too, were eaten, though perhaps less commonly preserved for voyages than other livestock. Imagine the scene before the voyage. It's slaughtering season. Animals that weren't needed for breeding or milk, or those that might not survive the lean winter months, would be culled. This wasn't a sentimental affair. It was a practical necessity. Every part of the animal would be used. The meat, of course, was prized. Large cuts would be prepared for preservation. Salting was a key method. The meat would be rubbed with coarse salt, or brined in a salt solution. Salt draws out moisture, creating an environment inhospitable to the bacteria that cause spoilage. This process also, naturally, made the meat incredibly salty. You wouldn't just fry up a slice of this and enjoy it. It would likely need to be soaked in fresh water for a long time before it was even remotely palatable, if fresh water could be spared for such a luxury. Drying was another crucial technique, often used in conjunction with salting. Thin strips of meat, or even larger pieces, would be hung in airy, dry places, perhaps in a smokehouse or simply in a breezy spot, protected from insects as much as possible. The Nordic climate, with its cold, dry air, was actually quite conducive to this. Think of jerky, but on a much larger, more rustic scale. This dried meat, sometimes called stjørpekjøtt in Norway, a wind-dried mutton or lamb, often unsalted, would become incredibly hard and lightweight, perfect for transport. It would be tough, chewy, and intensely flavored, if intensely salty counts as a flavor. You'd need strong teeth and a patient jaw to get through a piece of it. Smoking was the third pillar of meat preservation. Hanging meat in a smokehouse, exposed to the smoke from slow-burning wood, not only dried it further but also imparted antimicrobial compounds from the smoke, adding another layer of protection against spoilage. The type of wood used would also subtly influence the flavor. Pine or juniper might have been common. The resulting product would be a dark, leathery, smoky piece of protein that, again, would last for a very long time. So, on board the longship, you wouldn't see sides of fresh beef hanging. Instead, you'd have bundles of these dried, salted, or smoked meats, perhaps wrapped in cloth or packed into wooden chests to protect them from the worst of the damp. They might look more like weathered pieces of wood or dark, shrunken leather than something you'd readily identify as dinner. The historical fact here is that these preservation methods were not unique to the Vikings. They were ancient techniques used across many cultures. However, the Vikings perfected them for their specific needs and environment, allowing them to undertake voyages that would have been impossible otherwise. Now, how would you actually eat this stuff? You wouldn't just gnaw on a rock-hard, salt-encrusted piece of 3-month-old smoked mutton, not unless you were truly desperate, which, let's be honest, probably happened. More likely, pieces would be hacked off and added to the communal cooking pot, if one was in use. Simmered for a long time in water or broth, perhaps made from reconstituted dried vegetables or even seaweed, the meat would slowly soften and release some of its salt and smoky flavor into the stew. It would still be chewy, undoubtedly, but it would provide that vital protein and a savory depth to an otherwise bland meal of porridge or grains. Think of it as a flavor bomb, albeit a very rustic one. A few small pieces could transform a bland gruel into something slightly more substantial, and dare we say, almost tasty. Almost. Historians still argue about the exact proportion of preserved land animal meat versus fish in the Viking diet at sea. Given the ease of preserving fish in coastal communities and the challenges of carrying enough fodder if live animals were brought for later slaughter, fish might have been more dominant on many voyages. However, for special occasions, or for those who could afford it, preserved land meat would have been a valued commodity. Perhaps a jarl or a particularly wealthy trader might have a private stash of prime smoked pork. Here's a quirky tidbit. It's been suggested that Vikings might have also preserved blood. Blood sausage is a traditional food in many Nordic countries, and blood itself, when dried or mixed with flour and baked, can be a nutritious, if somewhat unusual, food source. Think of a very, very rustic black pudding, but designed to last for months. Again, It's about using every part of the animal and finding ways to make it last. You can almost hear the crew debating. Right, who's for the blood jerky? And who wants another go at the mystery meat that looks suspiciously like Bjorn's old boot? The presence of these preserved meats also speaks to the economy back home. Raising enough livestock to provide a surplus for such voyages required significant resources: land for grazing, fodder for winter, and the labor to care for the animals. So, a ship well stocked with preserved meat wasn't just a sign of good planning. It was also a reflection of the prosperity and agricultural stability of the community that sent it forth. Imagine the psychological comfort, too. Even if it's tough and salty, the taste of familiar meat, however altered by preservation, could be a small reminder of home, a connection to the life left behind. In the vast, alien environment of the open ocean, such small comforts could be incredibly important for morale. It's one thing to eat anonymous hardtack. It's another to chew on a piece of dried lamb that you know came from your own village's flock. So, when you picture a Viking feasting, don't just think of roasted joints dripping with fat at a longhouse table. Think also of the sailor, huddled against the cold spray, patiently soaking a piece of leathery, salt-cured beef in his wooden cup, or painstakingly shredding dried mutton into a communal pot. This was the reality of protein on the move. It wasn't elegant, but it was effective. It was the fuel that built an empire, one chewy, salty mouthful at a time. And you can bet they weren't complaining about the cholesterol levels. They were probably more worried about their teeth surviving the experience. Having covered the land-based protein, often tough as old boots but vital nonetheless, we now turn our gaze to the vast, shimmering pantry that surrounded our Viking voyagers every single day, the sea itself. And when it came to preserved seafood, one particular product stands head and shoulders above the rest, a true icon of the Viking Age and beyond: stockfish. If hardtack was the carbohydrate king of the long voyage, then stockfish was its Piscean counterpart, the protein monarch of the North Atlantic. Stockfish, quite simply, is unsalted fish, usually cod, dried by cold air and wind on wooden racks, called gel in Norway. The process is most effective in cold, dry climates, making places like northern Norway and Iceland ideal production centers. The fish are gutted, often beheaded, and hung out to dry for months, typically during the winter and early spring when the temperatures are just above freezing and the air is less humid. The water content of the fish can drop from around 80% to as little as 15 to 20%, transforming it into a board-hard, incredibly durable foodstuff. Think of it as fish jerky, but on a grand, whole fish scale. A well-dried stockfish could last for years, literally, without refrigeration or any other form of preservation. It was lightweight, nutrient-dense, and almost indestructible, perfect for long sea voyages. You can imagine the scene in a place like Lofoten in Norway, even today a major stockfish producer. Vast outdoor cathedrals of wooden racks, hung with thousands upon thousands of cod, their silvery bodies swaying gently in the crisp Arctic air. It's an ancient tradition, and the historical fact is that the Vikings were masters of this. They didn't invent drying fish, of course. That's a technique as old as fishing itself, but they scaled it up and turned stockfish into a major trade commodity, as well as a vital provision for their own expeditions. It was, in many ways, the foundation of their ability to project power and explore across vast oceanic distances. So, how would you prepare this culinary delight on board your longship, which, remember, probably smells faintly of damp wool, old bilge water, and 60 unwashed sailors? Well, you don't just start gnawing on a stockfish like it's a fish-flavored lollipop. It would be like trying to eat a plank of wood. The first step, and this is crucial, was rehydration. But this wasn't a quick soak. Traditionally, stockfish needs to be hammered first, literally beaten with a mallet or club, to break down the incredibly tough, dried muscle fibers. You can picture a designated stockfish thrasher on board, perhaps a burly sailor with a good arm, rhythmically pounding away at the desiccated cod, the percussive thuds echoing across the deck. It's probably not a job you'd volunteer for after a long shift at the oars. All right, lads, who's on fish bashing duty today? Try not to hit your thumb, Sven. We need that for rowing. After its vigorous massage, the stockfish would then be soaked in fresh water, if available, or even seawater, for several days, with the water being changed periodically. This slow rehydration process would gradually return some moisture to the flesh, making it somewhat more pliable and edible. Even then, it wouldn't be tender by modern standards. It would still be firm, chewy, and intensely fishy. Once rehydrated, the stockfish could be cooked in various ways. Most commonly, it would be added to stews or soups, simmered along with grains, perhaps some dried vegetables if they had any, and maybe those pieces of preserved land meat we talked about earlier. The stockfish would lend its strong flavor to the entire pot, and its protein would add much needed sustenance. It could also be boiled or steamed on its own, perhaps served with a dollop of rendered fat or butter if such luxuries were available. Historians still argue about the palatability of stockfish to the Viking palate. Was it considered a desirable food, or merely a necessary evil, endured for its nutritional benefits? Given its ubiquity and importance in their diet, both at home and at sea, it was likely accepted as a normal, if not thrilling, part of life. Perhaps, like many acquired tastes, its familiarity bred a certain stoic acceptance, if not outright affection. Now for a quirky tidbit. Stockfish is so durable that it's been used for some rather unusual purposes over the centuries. There are tales of it being used as emergency building material, or even as a form of currency in some isolated communities. While Vikings probably weren't building life rafts out of cod, the sheer toughness and longevity of the product are legendary. It's said that a well-dried stockfish is so hard you could hammer a nail with it, though I wouldn't recommend trying that with your dinner. Beyond cod, other types of fish were also preserved, though perhaps not always with the same industrial scale as stockfish. Herring, for instance, a fatty fish, was more commonly salted or smoked rather than just air-dried, as its high oil content could lead to rancidity if not properly treated. So, barrels of salted herring would have been another common sight in the longship's larder. These would be incredibly salty, requiring soaking before consumption, and would offer a different flavor profile and texture to the lean, dry stockfish. You might also find dried flatfish, or even freshwater fish if the voyage started from an inland waterway. And let's not forget other sea bounty. Seaweed, as we touched upon in a previous hypothetical. Remember that crocodile dung sunscreen chat? Totally different topic, but good callback. Was readily available along coastlines and is surprisingly nutritious. While perhaps not a primary staple for long voyages out of sight of land, it could certainly have been gathered during coastal stops and either eaten fresh or dried for later use. Some types of seaweed are rich in vitamins and minerals, which would have been a welcome, if perhaps slimy, addition to the diet. Imagine chewing on some dried dulse, leathery and salty, like a kind of oceanic fruit leather. The sheer abundance of fish in the North Atlantic was a huge advantage for the Vikings. Even if preserved stocks ran low, there was always the possibility of catching fresh fish, which we'll explore more later. But the ability to preserve vast quantities of fish, transforming a perishable resource into a long-lasting, portable protein powerhouse, was a cornerstone of their maritime prowess. So, as you sit there, perhaps diligently pounding a desiccated cod with a wooden mallet, or watching pieces of rehydrated stockfish slowly simmer in the communal pot, you're participating in a tradition that fueled exploration, trade, and conquest for centuries. It might not win any culinary awards today, but stockfish, in its humble, board-like way, helped the Vikings navigate their world. Each chewy, protein-packed bite was a small victory against the vastness of the sea and the ever-present threat of hunger. And who knows, maybe after a few months at sea, even you would start to look forward to your daily dose of reconstituted cod. Or maybe not. Alright, we've covered the rather unglamorous world of hardtack, the chewy realities of preserved meat, and the board-like consistency of stockfish. You might be thinking the Viking voyage diet was entirely devoid of anything remotely, well, pleasant. But prepare for a slight, and I mean slight, dairy-based surprise. While fresh milk was obviously a non-starter for long sea journeys, the Vikings were ingenious when it came to transforming perishable milk into transportable, longer-lasting dairy products. We're talking about cheese and skyr, folks. Not exactly a delicate breed, but a welcome change of texture and taste. First, let's consider the source. The Vikings kept cattle, sheep, and goats, all of which provided milk. Back on land, milk and fresh dairy products like butter and simple fresh cheeses would have been common. But how do you take that on a month-long ocean voyage without it turning into something best used as a chemical weapon? The answer lies in fermentation and dehydration, the same principles we saw with meat and fish. Cheese is the most obvious candidate. Cheese making is, at its heart, a preservation technique. By curdling milk, separating the curds from the whey, and then pressing and often salting the curds, you create a product that is much less hospitable to spoilage bacteria than fresh milk. Different methods of production, types of milk, and aging processes result in a vast array of cheeses, and the Vikings would have had their own rustic versions. These wouldn't have been fancy, wax-rind cheddars or delicate camemberts. Think simpler, harder, and probably quite pungent cheeses. These cheeses would likely have been pressed to remove as much whey, moisture, as possible, making them denser and more durable. They might have been heavily salted, both for flavor and further preservation. Some could have been air-dried to become even harder, almost like a dairy equivalent of hardtack. You can imagine small, hard wheels or blocks of cheese, perhaps wrapped in cloth or leaves, or sealed in wooden containers, tucked away in the longship's stores. They would provide valuable protein and fat, and a tangy, savory flavor that would be a welcome contrast to the blandness of porridge or the saltiness of preserved meats and fish. A sliver of hard cheese, gnawed on slowly, could be a real treat, relatively speaking. Anyone fancy a bit of this 3-month-old goat's cheese? It's got a lovely character to it, and a few interesting blue bits. Then there's skyr. This is a traditional Icelandic cultured dairy product, similar to a very thick, strained yogurt. While fresh skyr as we know it today, with its creamy texture, wouldn't last long on a voyage, the historical fact is that a more concentrated, preserved form of skyr was likely made and transported. By fermenting milk with specific bacterial cultures and then straining it extensively to remove almost all the whey, you get a very dense, high-protein, low-fat product. This concentrated skyr could then be stored for considerable periods, especially in cool conditions. It might have been kept in wooden tubs or leather bags. Its tart, acidic flavor would also have helped to preserve it. Think of it as a kind of sour, super condensed yogurt paste. It could be eaten on its own, or perhaps mixed with a little water or even ale to make it more palatable, or sweetened with honey or berries if such luxuries were available, though honey was a precious commodity, not usually slathered liberally on sea rations. Skyr was, and still is, renowned for its high protein content, making it an excellent source of sustained energy. For a Viking sailor, a dollop of this potent dairy product could provide a significant nutritional boost. Historians still argue about the exact methods used to preserve skyr for very long voyages and how widespread its use was on ships compared to harder cheeses. Some suggest that it might have been dried further into a kind of powder or crumbly solid, which could then be reconstituted. Whatever the form, the principle of using beneficial bacterial cultures to transform and preserve milk was well understood. Now for a quirky tidbit. It's said that when the early Norse settlers arrived in Iceland, they brought their skyr-making cultures with them, and these cultures have been maintained and passed down through generations. So, the skyr you might eat in Iceland today could, in a very indirect way, be a descendant of the same stuff that sustained those first Viking explorers on their perilous journeys. It's like a living, edible piece of history, which is a rather more appealing thought than a living, edible piece of weevil-infested hardtack. Butter was another dairy product that could be preserved, though it presented more challenges. Heavily salted butter, packed tightly into wooden kegs or even animal bladders to exclude air, could last for some time, especially in the cooler temperatures of the North Atlantic. It would primarily be a source of fat, valuable for energy, and could be used in cooking, if any was happening, or spread on hardtack to make it slightly less soul-destroying. However, rancidity would always be a risk with butter, especially if temperatures rose or seals weren't perfect. You'd probably know if the butter had turned by the smell alone, adding another delightful fragrance to the ship's already complex bouquet. The presence of these preserved dairy products also tells us something about the livestock management of the Vikings. To produce enough surplus milk for cheese making or skyr production on a scale that could supply sea voyages, they needed well-managed herds and an understanding of lactation cycles. It also, again, points to the crucial role of women in the Viking economy, as dairy processing was traditionally women's work. They were the alchemists turning perishable milk into travel-worthy gold. So, while the Viking diet at sea was undeniably harsh, it wasn't entirely devoid of variety. A piece of hard, salty cheese or a scoop of tangy, concentrated skyr could offer a different texture, a different flavor profile, and a valuable hit of protein and fat. It might not be a Parisian cheese board, but on a wave-tossed longship, hundreds of miles from land, these dairy surprises would have been a welcome and important part of the nutritional puzzle. Just imagine trying to explain lactose intolerance to a Viking. "You mean you can't eat this perfectly good year-old goat cheese, Leaf? What's wrong with you, man? More for me, then." So far, we've been focused on the provisions carefully packed before the voyage. The hardtack, the dried meats, the stockfish, and those surprising dairy products. But what happened when the longship, by design or necessity, found itself close to a coastline, even if it wasn't the final destination? Well, that presented a golden opportunity for a bit of what we might call coastal stop and shop, Viking style. This wasn't about finding a charming seaside cafe. It was about opportunistic foraging and hunting to supplement their dwindling, and likely monotonous, shipboard stores. Viking longships, with their shallow drafts, were perfectly designed for this. They could easily navigate into shallow bays, estuaries, and even up rivers, allowing the crew to make landfall in places inaccessible to larger, deeper-hulled vessels. These brief coastal stops, whether planned as part of the route or forced by storms or the need for repairs, were crucial interludes where fresh food and water could be obtained. Imagine the relief. After weeks at sea, subsisting on hard, salty, or bland fare, the sight of land, any land, would be a profound morale booster. And the prospect of fresh food? That would be like dreaming of an oasis in a desert. As soon as it was safe to do so, and safe is a relative term, as any unfamiliar coastline could hold hostile inhabitants, foraging parties would likely be dispatched. What would they be looking for? Pretty much anything edible. On the shorelines themselves, shellfish would be an obvious target. Mussels, oysters, clams, winkles, these could be gathered in abundance from rocky coasts or tidal flats. They provided fresh protein and a welcome change from dried fish. You can picture Vikings, armed with knives or small axes, prying shellfish from rocks, their sacks quickly filling. Of course, they need to be cooked, perhaps steamed open over a quickly built fire on the beach, or added to a communal pot if one could be safely established. Seaweed, as we've touched upon, remember our stockfish saga, would also be readily available. Different varieties like dulse, kelp, or sea lettuce could be gathered. Some might be eaten fresh, offering valuable vitamins and minerals. Others could be dried quickly on the rocks in the sun and wind, to be added to the ship's stores for later use. It's like nature's own multivitamin aisle, if you know where to look and don't mind a bit of a slimy texture. Bird life would be another key resource. Coastal areas and islands are often teeming with seabirds, and their eggs would have been a prized find. During nesting season, Vikings could collect eggs in large quantities: gull eggs, tern eggs, puffin eggs, though puffins might have put up more of a fight, bless their colorful beaks. The birds themselves could also be hunted, perhaps with snares, nets, or even bows and arrows if they had skilled archers among the crew. Roasted seabird, even a tough old gull, would taste like a feast after weeks of preserved rations. Look, Ragnar, a cormorant! Tastes like chicken, if chicken lived by the sea and ate mostly fish guts. Moving slightly inland from the immediate shore, the foraging parties would look for edible plants. Depending on the season and location, this could include wild berries, bilberries, crowberries, cloudberries in more northerly regions, edible roots, like wild parsnips or turnips, though identifying these correctly is crucial to avoid poisonous lookalikes, wild greens, nettles, sorrel, dandelion leaves, all surprisingly nutritious when young, and nuts, hazelnuts, if available. The historical fact here is that the Vikings, like any people living close to nature, would have possessed a significant body of knowledge about edible wild plants, passed down through generations. This wasn't just random picking, it was skilled harvesting. Small animals might also be hunted during these brief landfalls. Rabbits, hares, squirrels, or even larger game like deer, if they were lucky and had the time and means for a proper hunt, could provide a substantial amount of fresh meat. This would be a welcome change from the heavily preserved meats from their stores. A quickly butchered deer, roasted over an open fire on a remote beach, would be a veritable banquet, the stuff of legends to be recounted later in the voyage. Fresh water would, of course, be a top priority. Any streams or springs found would be used to replenish their dwindling and possibly stale water casks. This was as vital as any food they could find. Historians still argue about the frequency and duration of these coastal foraging stops. Were they regular, planned events on longer voyages, or more opportunistic and desperate measures? It likely depended on the nature of the voyage, raiding versus trading versus exploration, the route taken, and the conditions encountered. For example, voyages directly across the open North Atlantic, like from Norway to Iceland, would offer fewer opportunities for such stops compared to a journey that hugged the coastlines of Europe. And here's a quirky tidbit: it's plausible that Vikings engaged in a bit of guerrilla gardening, or, more accurately, opportunistic planting. If they knew they might return to a particular remote but resource-rich spot, or if they were establishing a temporary base, they might have planted fast-growing vegetables or herbs. There's some, albeit scant, archaeological and saga evidence suggesting that they occasionally cultivated small plots even during their explorations, perhaps to ensure a food source for a return journey or for a small, overwintering party. Imagine planting a few hardy root vegetables on a remote Greenlandic fjord, hoping they'd be there when you, or another Viking crew, pass by next season. These coastal stop and shop moments were not without risk. The land might be uninhabited, or it might be home to people who weren't thrilled to see a band of heavily armed Vikings turn up uninvited to strip their local resources. Skirmishes could occur. So, foraging parties would need to be vigilant, with sentries posted. It was a calculated risk, balancing the need for fresh supplies against the danger of hostile encounters. But the rewards: fresh food, fresh water, a break from the confines of the ship, and a boost to morale, were often worth it. These interludes were a vital part of the Viking voyaging strategy, a way of living off the land and sea, even when far from home. It demonstrates their adaptability and their deep understanding of the natural world, turning even a seemingly barren coastline into a temporary larder. It's a far cry from a supermarket run, but for a weary Viking sailor, a handful of fresh mussels or a juicy berry was a taste of paradise. So, our Viking crew has had a refreshing, if somewhat risky, stop and shop along a convenient coastline, perhaps feasting on roasted puffins and foraged berries. But what about those long stretches when land is just a distant memory, a green smudge on the horizon that faded days ago, or not even a smudge at all, just endless, rolling ocean? Were they entirely reliant on the hardtack and stockfish then? Not necessarily. The sea itself, their constant companion, could also be a source of fresh protein, thanks to opportunistic fishing and, occasionally, hunting. You have to imagine the scene: the longship, a tiny speck in the vastness of the North Atlantic. Days turn into weeks. The initial excitement, or dread, of the voyage has settled into a routine of watches, rowing, and enduring the elements. The preserved food, however carefully managed, is becoming monotonous. This is when the prospect of fresh fish, pulled directly from the deep, would become incredibly appealing. The Vikings were, first and foremost, a maritime people. Fishing wasn't just a coastal activity for them, it was deeply ingrained in their culture and economy. They would have been skilled fishermen, familiar with the habits of various North Atlantic species. So, even in the open ocean, they would have been on the lookout for signs of fish, flocks of seabirds diving, the presence of marine mammals, or even just a fishy look to the water. What kind of fishing could they do from a moving, or even becalmed, longship? Handlines would have been the most practical method. A simple line, made from animal sinew, plant fibers like hemp or nettle, or even treated leather strips, would be fitted with a hook and bait. Hooks could be fashioned from bone, antler, iron, or even wood. The historical fact is that archaeological finds from Viking sites include a variety of fish hooks, testament to their importance. You can picture a sailor, during a lull in his duties, patiently holding a line, feeling for the telltale tug of a fish. It would be a quiet, contemplative activity, a small act of hope in the great emptiness. What were they hoping to catch? Cod, of course, was a prime target, even in deeper waters. Haddock, scythe, collie, ling, and halibut were also possibilities, depending on the depth and location. These are all substantial, nutritious fish that would provide a good meal. Trolling a line behind the moving ship might also have yielded results, attracting predatory fish. Bait could be an issue on a long voyage. They might use scraps from their preserved fish, or pieces of salted meat. Perhaps they even had a small, dedicated stash of particularly smelly, preserved fish guts specifically for bait, the kind of thing that would make your eyes water but that a hungry cod might find irresistible. Past the essence of week-old herring guts, Olaf, I feel lucky today. Nets were less practical for deep-sea fishing from a longship, as they are bulky and require more specialized handling, but smaller nets might have been used if they encountered shoals of fish near the surface, like mackerel or herring, especially if the ship was becalmed. Spears or harpoons might also have been on board, primarily for larger game or defense, but a skilled spearman could potentially take a large fish if it came close enough to the surface. Historians still argue about how much of a typical Viking voyage diet was supplemented by fresh-caught fish versus relying on preserved stores. It would have been highly variable, depending on the season, the route, the skill of the fishermen on board, and sheer luck. Some voyages might have been blessed with abundant catches, while others might have found the seas disappointingly empty. However, any fresh fish would have been a significant boon, not just for the calories and protein, but also for the fresh nutrients, like vitamin D, which could help ward off deficiencies. Now for a quirky tidbit, it's possible that Vikings, like other maritime cultures, observed marine mammals like whales or dolphins not just as magnificent creatures, but also as indicators of fishing grounds. Where there are dolphins feeding, there are often smaller fish. And while deliberately hunting large whales from a longship would have been an incredibly dangerous and difficult undertaking, though not unheard of for specialized whaling crews inshore, a stranded or recently deceased whale encountered at sea would have been a massive, if somewhat gruesome, windfall. Imagine coming across a floating whale carcass. It would be an all-hands-on-deck situation to hack off as much meat and blubber as possible before it sank or sharks claimed it all. The blubber, rich in fat, could be rendered down for oil, for lamps, or even consumption, and the meat, if fresh enough, eaten or preserved. It's not exactly a picturesque picnic, but survival often isn't. Seals might also have been hunted if encountered hauled out on ice floes, particularly in more northerly waters en route to Greenland or Vinland. A seal could provide meat, fat, and a valuable hide. Again, this would require skill and daring, as hunting seals from a boat is no easy task. The psychological impact of a fresh catch would have been immense. Imagine the cheer that would go up when a large cod or halibut was hauled over the side. It would be a break in the monotony, a moment of excitement and shared success. The fish would be quickly gutted and prepared, perhaps boiled in seawater or cooked over a carefully managed fire if conditions allowed. The taste of fresh, flaky fish, after weeks of hard, salty rations, would be a true delicacy. It's the kind of simple pleasure that we take for granted, but for them, it would have been a feast. So, while the preserved stores formed the backbone of their sustenance, the Viking sailor was also an opportunistic hunter-gatherer of the sea. Every dangling line was a hopeful question mark dropped into the depths. Every fresh fish pulled aboard was a small miracle, a gift from Ran, the Norse goddess of the sea, who was, by all accounts, a rather capricious and demanding deity, so any gifts were gratefully received. This ability to draw fresh sustenance directly from their environment, even in the seemingly barren open ocean, was another testament to their resilience and their intimate connection with the marine world. It wasn't just a highway for them, it was also, sometimes, a larder. Alright, we've chewed our way through hardtack, gnawed on stockfish, and even imagined the occasional fresh-caught cod. But all this eating, however rustic, brings up another absolutely fundamental need on any long voyage: hydration. What were our Viking friends drinking to wash down all that salty, dry fare, and simply to stay alive? The story of thirst and tipples on a longship is as crucial as the food itself. The most obvious and essential liquid was, of course, water. Fresh water. Without it, human life grinds to a halt very quickly. So, a significant portion of the longship's precious cargo space would have been dedicated to carrying water. This would likely have been stored in wooden casks or barrels, carefully made by coopers to be as watertight as possible. Leather bags or water skins might also have been used, perhaps for smaller quantities or personal supplies. Imagine the scene before departure: a constant procession of crew members or helpers, filling these containers from a clean spring or river, then carefully stowing them low and central in the ship, where their weight would contribute to ballast and stability, as we discussed with the longship larder logic. The sheer volume of water needed for a crew of, say, 30 to 60 men for several weeks or months would have been immense. Calculations would have been made, but there's always the risk of spillage, leakage, or simply underestimating the duration of the voyage. Running out of water in the middle of the ocean was a terrifying prospect, far more immediately dire than running low on hardtack. The quality of the stored water would also have been a major concern. Over time, even in well-sealed casks, water can become stale, developing an unpleasant taste and potentially harboring bacteria. While the cool temperatures of the North Atlantic might have helped slow down spoilage compared to tropical voyages, it was still a risk. They wouldn't have had modern water purification methods. Perhaps they added certain herbs or even a small amount of alcohol, like ale, to casks in an attempt to keep the water sweeter for longer, a practice seen in later naval traditions, though direct evidence for this in Viking times is scarce. More likely, they just had to tolerate increasingly unpleasant water as the voyage wore on. Remember our chat about coastal stop and shop. Replenishing fresh water supplies at every opportunity would have been a top priority during any landfall. But water wasn't the only beverage on board. The Vikings were renowned for their love of ale and mead, and these drinks also made their way onto long voyages. Ale, a beer brewed from malted barley without hops became common later, was a staple drink in Viking society. It was nutritious, providing carbohydrates and some B vitamins, and was generally safer to drink than water of uncertain purity, as the brewing process involved boiling. While the alcohol content of everyday Viking ale was likely quite low, perhaps comparable to a modern light beer, it still had a preservative effect. So, barrels of ale would have been a common sight alongside the water casks. It would have been a source of hydration, calories, and perhaps a bit of cheer on a long, arduous journey. Imagine the end of a grueling rowing shift, the sailors gratefully accepting a cup of cool, slightly sour ale. It would be more than just a drink. It would be a small reward, a moment of respite. Well, that's another 10 leagues closer to wherever we're going. Who's for an ale? Don't drink it too fast, Sven. It's got to last us till we find England. Mead, a fermented honey drink, was a more prestigious and likely more alcoholic beverage, often associated with feasts and special occasions. While probably not the everyday tipple on a long ship due to the preciousness of honey, it's conceivable that some mead was carried for the jarl or chieftain, or for specific celebrations or rituals during the voyage. A sip of strong, sweet mead could be a potent morale booster or a way to mark a significant event, like sighting land after a long crossing. The historical fact is that both ale and mead played important social and ritualistic roles in Viking culture, and it's reasonable to assume this extended to life at sea. The Eddic poems and sagas are full of references to drinking, feasting, and the communal sharing of ale and mead. Historians still argue about the exact ratio of water to ale carried on long voyages. Was ale considered a primary source of hydration, or more of a supplement to water? Given the risks associated with water storage, it's possible that ale, being safer and more nutritious, was consumed quite regularly by the crew, with fresh water perhaps being rationed more carefully or reserved for cooking. Now for a quirky tidbit. What about milk-based drinks? We talked about skyr, a thick, yogurt-like substance. It's also possible they carried soured milk or fermented whey, the watery byproduct of cheese making. These drinks, while perhaps not appealing to the modern palate, would have been hydrating, nutritious. Whey is rich in protein and minerals, and the fermentation process would have made them relatively safe to drink and store for a while. Imagine a Viking sailor quenching his thirst with a cup of tangy, slightly fizzy fermented whey. It sounds a bit like kombucha's Viking ancestor, doesn't it? Then there's the issue of salt. With a diet heavy in salted meat and fish, the crew would have had a significant salt intake, which increases thirst. So, adequate fluid intake was even more critical. Dehydration, exacerbated by exertion, seasickness, and a salty diet, would have been a constant threat. The containers themselves mattered. Wooden cups or drinking horns would have been used. Sharing a drinking horn was a communal act, reinforcing bonds within the crew. You can picture a horn of ale being passed from man to man as they huddled under the jawl during a storm, the shared drink a small comfort against the fury of the elements. So, the soundscape of a longship wouldn't just be the creak of timbers and the crash of waves. It would also be the slosh of liquids in barrels, the glug of ale being poured, the sighs of satisfaction, or grimaces, if the water was particularly foul. Managing these precious liquid resources was a constant, vital task. Every mouthful of water, every cup of ale, was a carefully measured step towards their destination, a defense against the debilitating effects of thirst. Just makes you appreciate that ice-cold, triple-filtered water in your fancy reusable bottle, doesn't it? The Vikings would have thought it was nectar from Valhalla itself. We've talked a lot about what the Vikings ate and drank on their long voyages: the hardtack, the stockfish, the preserved meats, the ale, the precious water. But how they stored these vital supplies is a story in itself, a testament to their ingenuity and understanding of the challenges posed by a long sea journey. The barrels, bags, and preservation methods they employed were just as crucial as the food itself. Get this wrong, and your meticulously planned larder could turn into a moldy, rat-infested disaster zone before you even cleared the fjords. The undisputed king of Viking storage technology was the wooden barrel or cask. Coopering, the craft of making barrels, was a highly skilled and essential trade. Viking coopers would have produced barrels of various sizes, from small kegs for butter or honey to large casks capable of holding significant quantities of water, ale, grain, or salted fish. These barrels weren't just rough containers. They were carefully constructed from staves of wood, often oak, known for its durability and tight grain, bound with hoops of wood, like hazel or willow, or sometimes iron, though iron was more precious. The design was crucial. A well-made barrel needed to be watertight, or at least very nearly so, to prevent leakage of valuable liquids or spoilage of dry goods by moisture. The staves would be shaped with incredible precision to fit together snugly, and the whole construction relied on tension and expert assembly. You can imagine a cooper, his workshop filled with the scent of sawdust and wood smoke, meticulously crafting these essential vessels, knowing that lives would depend on their integrity. The historical fact is that the quality of barrels could make or break a voyage. A leaky water cask was a crisis in the making. These barrels would be marked, perhaps with runes or simple symbols, to identify their contents. Water for drinking, ale for drinking was slightly more enthusiasm, salted herring, approach with caution and a strong stomach. Organization was key. As we discussed in the context of longship larder logic, heavier barrels would be stowed low and centrally for ballast. Accessing specific barrels during the voyage, especially in rough seas, would require careful planning and a system for shifting cargo as supplies were consumed. But barrels weren't the only option. Leather bags and sacks were also extensively used. These would have been made from animal hides, cattle, goat, or seal, treated to be as waterproof as possible, perhaps with oils, fats, or even birch tar, which has excellent water-repellent properties. Leather bags were versatile. They could be squeezed into irregular spaces where rigid barrels wouldn't fit. They were lighter than wooden barrels of equivalent volume, though perhaps less durable and more prone to puncture or tearing. Grain, flour, dried peas or beans, and perhaps even smaller quantities of dried fruit or nuts might have been stored in leather sacks. Imagine the careful stitching, the reinforcing patches, all designed to keep the precious contents safe and dry. Smaller wooden chests or boxes, often with carved decorations, because Vikings liked a bit of style, even in their storage solutions, would have been used for more valuable or delicate items. Perhaps a chieftain's personal supply of mead, or special dried herbs, or even tools and repair materials, were kept in these lockable chests. These chests often doubled as seats, as we've mentioned, making efficient use of the limited space. Now, beyond the containers themselves, what about other preservation methods actively employed or enhanced by the storage? We've talked about salting, drying, and smoking for meats and fish. But even with these methods, protecting the food from the damp, salty air of the ship was paramount. Wrapping items in cloth, perhaps oilcloth, canvas treated with oil to make it waterproof, could provide an extra layer of defense. Packing items tightly to exclude air would also help. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of Viking pest control on board. Rats and mice are notorious shipboard companions throughout history, capable of decimating food stores. Did Vikings have ship's cats? It's plausible, as cats were known in Scandinavia, but direct evidence for them being routine members of a longship crew specifically for pest control is debated. More likely, they relied on well-sealed containers and vigilance. And, as we grimly noted with hardtack, sometimes the pests just became an unwelcome part of the meal. Don't worry about the extra crunch in your porridge, Eric, it's just extra protein. Here's a quirky tidbit. Think about the preservation of knowledge itself. While not food, the Vikings sometimes carried precious, fragile items like carved whalebone plaques or even, rarely, manuscripts. Storing these safely from the elements and the rough and tumble of shipboard life would have required very special containers and care. Perhaps a beautifully carved wooden box, lined with soft fur, for a particularly important rune stick or a map incised on bone. It highlights that precious cargo wasn't always edible. The very atmosphere inside a laden longship would have been a complex miasma of smells emanating from these stored goods. The sharp tang of salt fish, the smoky aroma of cured meat, the earthy scent of damp grain, the sweetish notes of ale or mead, perhaps the slightly sour smell of fermenting skyr or soured milk, all mingling with the smell of tarred wood, damp wool, and unwashed bodies. It would be a unique, and probably quite potent, olfactory signature. You'd know a Viking longship was approaching by its smell long before you saw its dragon prow, especially if they were downwind. The life cycle of these containers is also interesting. Barrels could be reused, repaired, or repurposed. A barrel that once held ale might later be used for water, or even cut down to make a bucket or a tub. Nothing would go to waste if it could be helped. The careful stowage and management of these food containers were ongoing tasks. As supplies were consumed, the ship's balance would change, requiring cargo to be shifted. Keeping track of what was where, how much was left, and the condition of the remaining food was a critical responsibility, likely falling to an experienced member of the crew. This quartermaster figure would be the guardian of the larder, ensuring fair distribution and trying to make the supplies last. So, the humble barrel, the sturdy leather sack, the well-crafted wooden chest, these were the unsung heroes of Viking voyages. They were the shields protecting the precious cargo of sustenance from the relentless enemies of moisture, spoilage, and pests. Without these effective storage solutions, and the knowledge of how to use them, the grandest ambitions of Viking explorers and warriors would have dissolved into a soggy, inedible mess. It's a reminder that sometimes, the most revolutionary technologies are not the flashiest, but the most practical. And a good barrel was, for a Viking, very practical indeed. We've meticulously packed our longship's larder with barrels of ale, sacks of hardtack, and bundles of stockfish, all designed to last. But even the toughest Viking eventually craves something more than cold, dry rations. The thought of a hot meal, however simple, would be a powerful lure, especially during those long, cold, damp stretches in the North Atlantic. But how do you cook on a wooden ship, tossed by waves, without, setting the entire thing on fire and ending your voyage in a rather dramatic, unscheduled cremation? This brings us to the fascinating and frankly quite terrifying challenge of cooking with caution at sea. The primary concern, obviously, was fire. A longship was made of wood, often tarred wood, which is highly flammable. An open flame in the wrong place, or an errant spark, could spell disaster in minutes. So, any cooking setup had to be incredibly carefully managed. It's unlikely that Viking longships had permanent, built-in galleys or hearths in the way later larger sailing ships did. The design was too open, too focused on rowing space and speed. Instead, any cooking would likely have been done using a portable hearth or firebox. This might have been a shallow stone or metal box, perhaps lined with sand or clay to insulate the wooden deck beneath it. The historical fact is that archaeological evidence for such fireboxes or hearthstones has been found in association with Viking ships and settlements, suggesting their use. Imagine the scene: a designated spot on deck, perhaps amidships where it was most stable, carefully cleared. The firebox is set up, its base providing a barrier against the wooden planks. A small, controlled fire would be built within it, using carefully rationed firewood brought from land, or perhaps driftwood if they were lucky enough to find some. This fire wouldn't be a roaring bonfire, it would be just enough to heat a cooking pot. The cooking vessel itself would most likely be an iron cauldron or pot, suspended over the fire from a simple tripod or hung from an iron hook. These cauldrons were multi-purpose tools, used for cooking, boiling water, and perhaps even rendering fat. They were sturdy and could withstand direct heat. You can picture the ship's cook, not a fancy chef, but probably just a designated crew member with a bit of common sense and a steady hand, carefully tending this precarious setup. What kind of meals could be prepared? We're not talking about elaborate banquets. One-pot meals would be the order of the day. Porridge or gruel made from their stored grains, barley, oats, would be a staple hot meal, easily prepared by simmering the grain in water or ale. To this, they could add pieces of their preserved meat or stockfish, which would need to be rehydrated first. Remember our friend the stockfish thrasher? These additions would make the porridge more substantial and flavorful, and the long, slow simmering would help to soften the tough, dried ingredients. Perhaps some dried peas or beans, or even foraged seaweed, might be thrown in if available, creating a kind of Viking everything but the kitchen sink stew. This hot meal, even if simple and repetitive, would have provided immense comfort and a morale boost. The warmth of the food, the steam rising from the pot, the communal act of sharing a hot meal, these would be powerful antidotes to the cold, damp, and monotony of the voyage. Right, lads? Who wants some of Sven's special surprise stew? Last time it had a bootlace in it, this time, who knows? Adventure in every spoonful. However, cooking at sea was fraught with danger. In rough weather, it would be impossible. Imagine trying to keep a fire going and a pot from spilling when the ship is pitching and rolling violently. Any cooking would have to be suspended, and the crew would revert to cold rations. Even in relatively calm seas, a sudden lurch of the ship could send embers flying or hot food spilling, creating a serious burn hazard or, worse, a fire risk. Buckets of water or sand would have to be kept close at hand at all times, ready to douse any errant flames. Historians still argue about how frequently hot meals were actually prepared on long voyages. Was it a daily occurrence, or reserved for calmer weather and special occasions? Given the risks and the limited fuel, it might not have been an everyday event on the roughest ocean crossings. Perhaps on shorter coastal voyages or when sailing in calmer waters like fjords or rivers, hot food was more common. On the long hauls across the open Atlantic, cold rations might have been the norm for extended periods. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars have suggested that Vikings might have used a method of fireless cooking using heated stones. The idea is that stones would be heated in the firebox until glowing hot, then carefully transferred, using tongs, one hopes, into a wooden trough or even a sturdy leather bag containing water and the food to be cooked. The hot stones would bring the water to a simmer, cooking the food without a continuous open flame near the pot itself. This technique, known from various ancient cultures, could have reduced the risk of fire spreading from the cooking pot itself, though heating the stones still required a fire. It's a clever bit of low-tech thermal engineering. Another possibility for a warm meal, if not strictly cooked, involved simply soaking hardtack or dried meat in hot water or ale, if hot liquid could be safely prepared. This wouldn't be a stew, but it would make the food more palatable and provide some warmth. The fuel for the fire was another critical consideration. Firewood was bulky and would take up precious cargo space. They would have to be incredibly economical with its use. Perhaps they relied on finding driftwood during coastal stops, or even used dried animal dung as fuel in emergencies, a practice common in many resource-scarce environments. Every piece of wood would be hoarded like treasure. So, the image of a Viking longship should include not just the fearsome warriors and the skilled sailors, but also the careful, cautious cook, hunched over a small, smoky fire, trying to conjure a hot meal from meager ingredients while the ocean tries its best to upset his efforts. It was a constant battle against the elements, and the ever-present danger of fire. That warm bowl of porridge, that chunk of stewed stockfish, wasn't just food, it was a small, hard-won victory, a brief moment of comfort and normalcy in a profoundly challenging world. And you can bet they didn't have anyone complaining about the food being a bit bland. They were probably just grateful it was hot and didn't taste too much of singed deck planks. We've explored the types of food, the storage, even the risky business of cooking at sea. But what happened when, despite all the careful planning and provisioning, the voyage lasted longer than expected? When storms blew the longship off course, or when they were becalmed for weeks under a pitiless sun, or when the carefully gathered stores simply began to run out. This brings us to the grim realities of rationing and the ever-present, gaunt specter of starvation. No matter how much food was packed, there was always a finite supply. And on voyages that could last for months, with unpredictable weather and unknown destinations, the possibility of that supply dwindling to critical levels was a constant undercurrent of anxiety. This is where rationing would come into play. As food stocks began to visibly shrink, the person in charge of provisions, our Viking quartermaster, if you will, would have the unenviable task of implementing and enforcing rations. This wouldn't be a popular decision, but a necessary one for the survival of the entire crew. Portions would become smaller. The already unappetizing hardtack might be broken into even tinier pieces. The scoops of porridge would be shallower. The slivers of dried meat or stockfish in the communal pot would become rarer, more like a rumor than a substantial ingredient. Imagine the atmosphere on board as rations were cut. The initial grumbling, the tightened belts, the hungry looks exchanged between crew members. Trust in leadership would be severely tested. Fairness in distribution would be paramount. Any suspicion that the Jarl or his inner circle were getting more than their fair share could lead to dissent, even mutiny. The sagas, while often glorifying heroism, also hint at the tensions and hardships of long voyages, and disputes over food would certainly have been a major source of conflict. I saw Leif take 2 slivers of stockfish yesterday. He said one was for Odin, but I think Odin's on a diet. Water rationing would be even more critical and more quickly felt. Thirst is a more immediate and debilitating enemy than hunger. As water casks emptied, each man's daily allowance would be strictly measured out, perhaps just a cupful or 2. The suffering from thirst, the dry mouth, the cracking lips, the dizziness, the desperation, would be immense. Any fresh water found, even a shower of rain collected on a sail, would be a godsend, hoarded and distributed with utmost care. The historical fact is that starvation and dehydration were very real risks for any long-distance seafarers in the pre-modern era, and the Vikings were no exception. Skeletons from some Viking-age burials, particularly in early colonial contexts like Greenland, show signs of nutritional stress and hardship, indicating periods of severe food scarcity. While this might reflect conditions on land, it's highly likely that similar or worse privations were endured at sea during difficult voyages. As hunger gnawed, the crew's physical and mental state would deteriorate. Strength would wane, making the already arduous tasks of rowing and sailing even more difficult. Concentration would falter. Tempers would fray. The camaraderie forged in shared adventure could easily fracture under the relentless pressure of starvation. Men would become weaker, more susceptible to disease, and less able to cope with the harsh conditions. Historians still argue about the specific, last resort, foods Vikings might have turned to when true starvation loomed. We know they were incredibly resourceful. Would they have eaten the leather from their shoes or belts, boiled to try and extract some minimal sustenance, as sailors in other eras are recorded as doing? It's plausible. Perhaps they would try to consume parts of the ship itself, old rope, or even shavings of wood, though the nutritional value would be negligible and potentially harmful. What about their animal companions? If they were transporting livestock like sheep or goats, these would likely be slaughtered one by one as the situation became dire, even if they were intended as breeding stock for a new settlement. The emotional toll of sacrificing animals they had cared for, animals that represented future prosperity, would be significant, but survival would take precedence. And the grimmest question of all, did Vikings ever resort to cannibalism in extreme survival situations at sea? The sagas are generally silent on this taboo subject, and direct archaeological evidence is virtually impossible to find or interpret definitively. However, given the extreme circumstances that could arise on long, lost voyages, it's a possibility that cannot be entirely dismissed, as it has occurred in other desperate maritime survival stories throughout history. It's a chilling thought, and one that underscores the utter desperation they could face. Here's a quirky, though still grim, tidbit. In some maritime traditions, when a ship was lost and survivors were adrift in a small boat, the custom of the sea sometimes involved drawing lots to decide who would be sacrificed to feed the others. While there's no specific evidence of this as a formalized custom among Vikings, the brutal logic of survival in such extreme circumstances might have led to similar desperate acts, unrecorded and unspoken. The psychological torment of watching supplies dwindle, of seeing your shipmates weaken, of facing your own mortality from hunger and thirst, is hard to fathom. The hope that had launched the voyage would fade, replaced by a grim determination to simply endure, or a despairing resignation to fate. Yet, even in such dire straits, stories of incredible endurance and resourcefulness emerge from maritime history. Perhaps a lucky catch of fish, the unexpected sighting of land and a chance to forage, or even a fortunate encounter with another vessel could turn disaster into survival. The Vikings were renowned for their toughness and resilience. They were not a people who gave up easily. So, when we romanticize Viking voyages, with their dragon prows cleaving the waves, it's essential to remember this dark undercurrent. The fear of the empty barrel, the silent dread of the last biscuit, was as much a part of their reality as the thrill of exploration or the spoils of raiding. The success of their maritime expansion wasn't just about bold navigation and superior ships. It was also about an almost superhuman ability to endure hardship, to push the limits of human survival, and to face down the gaunt specter of starvation with a grim, Nordic resolve. And you thought you were having a bad day because the coffee machine was broken. We've spent a lot of time with the men on the longships, imagining their struggles with hardtack and stockfish, their battles against hunger and thirst. But before a single oar was dipped into the water, before the dragon prow even tasted the salt spray, a huge amount of work had already been done on land. And a significant, often overlooked, part of that vital preparation fell to the women of the Viking household. Their role in preparing the provisions for these ambitious voyages was absolutely crucial, even if they weren't typically sailing on the raiding or exploration ships themselves. The women certainly participated in colonization voyages. Think about the sheer scale of food preservation we've discussed. Drying vast quantities of meat and fish, salting down barrels of herring, grinding grain into flour, baking endless batches of hard, durable bread, making cheese or skyr that could withstand a long journey. These were not casual, afternoon tasks. These were labor-intensive, time-consuming processes that required skill, knowledge, and a lot of hard work. And in the Viking Age, food preservation and preparation were predominantly within the sphere of women's responsibilities. Imagine a Viking farmstead in the months leading up to a major voyage. The men might be busy with ship repairs, crafting weapons, or engaged in local raiding or trading. But the women would be at the heart of the domestic economy, overseeing the stores and transforming perishable raw ingredients into travel-ready sustenance. You'd see them tending smoking sheds where fish or meat hung, turning the pieces to ensure even drying. They'd be working with salt, a precious commodity itself, carefully rubbing it into cuts of meat or layering it with fish in barrels. Their hands would be busy kneading dough for the hard, flatbreads or biscuits, tending ovens or hot stones for baking. They'd be stirring milk in large cauldrons for cheese making, pressing curds, and storing the finished cheeses in cool places to mature. The historical fact is that Viking women held a relatively high status compared to women in many other contemporary European societies. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even initiate divorce. Within the household, the Husfrida, lady of the house, was in charge. She held the keys to the storehouses and managed the family's resources, including the food supplies. This authority would have been critical in ensuring that enough food of the right quality was prepared and set aside for any planned voyages. She was the domestic quartermaster, the logistics manager of the home front. This wasn't just drudgery. It required considerable knowledge. Women would know the best techniques for preserving different types of food, the right time of year for certain processes, how to identify edible wild plants for supplementing the diet, knowledge they might impart if they were part of a colonization voyage, and how to manage resources to last through lean seasons and provide for long journeys. This knowledge was passed down from mother to daughter, a vital chain of domestic expertise. Remember, Astrid, always use the spring salt for the long voyage pork. It draws out the humors better. And don't let your father see you adding that extra bit of honey to his personal mead cask. He'll just drink it all before they clear the fjord. Consider the mental load as well. While the men might be dreaming of adventure or plunder, the women would be calculating. How much grain will be needed? How many sides of bacon? Will the dried cod last until they reach England, or should we prepare an extra batch? They were planning for the survival of their husbands, sons, and kinsmen. Their work was driven by a profound sense of responsibility, and no doubt, a deep-seated anxiety for the well-being of those venturing out onto the dangerous seas. Historians still argue about the extent to which women were directly consulted by the men planning the voyages regarding the types and quantities of provisions. Given their control over food production and storage, it seems highly probable that their input would have been essential. A Jarl might decide to go on a voyage, but he would likely rely heavily on the Husfrida and other experienced women to ensure his crew didn't starve halfway there. Now for a quirky tidbit. Textiles were another crucial contribution from women that indirectly impacted sustenance. Warm clothing, woolen cloaks, tunics, leggings, mittens, hats, was essential for survival in the cold, damp conditions of a North Atlantic voyage. Keeping the crew warm meant they expended less energy just staying alive, which in turn meant their food rations would go further. Spinning wool, weaving fabric, and sewing garments were all skilled tasks performed by women. So, every stitch in a warm cloak was, in a way, a contribution to the voyage's food security. It's a more holistic view of provisioning. Furthermore, if women were part of a colonization voyage, like those to Iceland or Greenland, their role became even more direct and vital on arrival. They brought with them the knowledge of farming, animal husbandry, and food preservation necessary to establish a new life in a new land. They would be the ones setting up the new dairies, planting the first meager crops, and ensuring the survival of the small, precious herds of livestock that made it across the ocean. They weren't just passengers, they were pioneers, carrying the seeds of a new society in their hands and in their knowledge. The farewells at the shore would have been poignant. The women, having poured their energy and skill into preparing the voyage, would watch their men sail away, knowing that their efforts were now sealed in those barrels and sacks, a tangible expression of their care and hope for a safe return. The success of Viking maritime endeavors was built not just on the courage of the sailors or the craftsmanship of the shipbuilders, but equally on the often invisible, yet utterly indispensable, labor of the women on shore. They were the silent partners in every voyage, their contribution measured in every mouthful of preserved food that sustained the crews across the waves. So, next time you see a depiction of a Viking longship, remember the hands that packed its larder. They were just as vital as the hands that pulled the oars. So, our Vikings are out on the vast ocean, their initial provisions, so carefully prepared by the women back home, steadily diminishing. We've discussed foraging during coastal stops and opportunistic fishing. But there was another way they could supplement their larder, particularly if their voyage took them near established trade routes or into waters frequented by other cultures, trading for sustenance. While Vikings are often stereotyped solely as raiders, pillaging and plundering their way across Europe, the historical fact is that they were also astute traders. They established extensive trade networks, stretching from the British Isles and continental Europe all the way to Byzantium and the Middle East via the Russian rivers. And while they traded in luxury goods like furs, amber, walrus ivory, and slaves, they also engaged in more mundane, but equally vital, trade for basic commodities, including food. Imagine a longship, perhaps a few weeks into its journey, encountering a group of Frisian or Frankish merchant ships in the North Sea or the English Channel. Or perhaps they put into a small, relatively peaceful coastal settlement in England or Normandy, not with immediate intent to raid, though that option was probably always on the table if an opportunity presented itself, but to see what could be bartered. This wasn't Amazon Fresh delivering to your longship, but it was a chance to acquire supplies. What would they offer in trade? Perhaps some of their own surplus goods from Scandinavia, maybe some dried fish if they had an excess, or iron tools, or even small manufactured goods like combs made of antler, which were a common Viking export. Or if they were returning from a successful raid further afield, they might have silver, jewelry, or other plundered items that could be exchanged for something more immediately useful, like a barrel of fresh water or a sack of grain. A lovely silver brooch for that slightly moldy-looking sack of rye? Seems like a fair trade, doesn't it, Jean-Pierre? Don't mind the scorch marks on the brooch. What would they be looking to acquire? Fresh food would be top of the list if available. Fresh bread, if they encountered a settlement with bakers, would be a luxury. Fresh fruit or vegetables, even if they wouldn't last long, would provide a welcome change and vital nutrients. Live animals, a couple of chickens, a piglet, or a goat, could be purchased and either kept alive on board for a short time or slaughtered immediately for fresh meat. This would be a significant morale booster after weeks of preserved rations. Even if fresh food wasn't available, they might trade for better quality preserved foods than their own, or simply more of what they were running low on. Perhaps a cask of Frankish wine, a real treat, or better quality flour, or barrels of salted pork from a region known for its pig farming. Ale from a different region might offer a welcome change in flavor. They might also trade for practical supplies like new rope, sailcloth, or tar for ship repairs, which, while not food, were essential for the continuation of the voyage and thus indirectly contributed to their ability to reach destinations where food could be found or produced. Historians still argue about the balance between raiding and trading in Viking activities. It likely varied significantly depending on the specific group, the period, and the region. Some Viking groups were undoubtedly more focused on plunder, while others were primarily merchants. But even for a raiding party, the option to trade for necessary supplies when raiding wasn't feasible or desirable would have been a valuable one. Sometimes it was simply easier, or less risky, to buy what you needed than to fight for it, especially if you were far from home and your crew was already tired or depleted. Here's a quirky tidbit. Vikings sometimes acted as mercenaries, hiring out their fighting skills to various rulers. Payment for these services could well have included substantial provisions. Imagine a Viking crew serving a Byzantine emperor or a Kievan Rus prince. Part of their contract would surely stipulate regular supplies of food and drink. So, in this context, they were fighting for their supper, in a very literal sense, but through a contractual agreement rather than direct plunder of the food itself. These trading encounters weren't always peaceful, of course. Misunderstandings, mistrust, or simply the temptation of a weaker party could easily lead to violence. A trade negotiation could quickly turn into a skirmish if one side felt cheated or saw an opportunity for easy gain. The line between trader and raider could be very thin and easily crossed. But the potential benefits of peaceful exchange, especially for essential supplies like food, often outweighed the risks. The ability to communicate, even in a rudimentary way, would be crucial for trade. While Old Norse was related to other Germanic languages, conversing with Slavs, Celts, or Romance language speakers would have required gestures, intermediaries, or perhaps individuals who had picked up a smattering of foreign tongues on previous voyages, the international businessmen of the Viking Age. So, the image of a Viking longship shouldn't just be one of a predatory war vessel. It was also, at times, a floating marketplace, a point of contact and exchange between different cultures. The need for sustenance, that most basic human requirement, could drive them to engage with others in surprisingly pragmatic ways. A barrel of fresh water, a sack of good grain, a few live chickens clucking in a cage on deck. These might not be the glorious treasures often associated with Viking hordes, but for a hungry crew far from home, they were worth their weight in silver. It's a reminder that even the fiercest warriors understood the value of a good bargain when their stomachs were rumbling. And if the bargain wasn't good, well, then the axe was always an option. We've painted a picture of resourcefulness and careful planning, from the women preparing provisions on land to the opportunistic foraging and trading at sea. But despite all these efforts, the Viking larder was under constant, relentless attack from insidious enemies that didn't wield swords or axes, rot, rats, and ruin. The battle against spoilage and pests was an ongoing, often losing, struggle on any long voyage, and it added another layer of misery and danger to life on a longship. First, let's talk about rot and mold. The environment on a Viking longship was almost perfectly designed for their proliferation. It was damp, relentlessly damp. Sea spray, rain, condensation, and the inevitable bilge water created a humid atmosphere. Even if barrels and bags were well sealed initially, moisture could seep in. The wood of the ship itself would be damp. In these conditions, mold spores, which are virtually everywhere, would find a happy home. Imagine checking your precious sack of hardtack, only to find the outer biscuits covered in a greenish-blue fuzz. Or opening a barrel of salted meat and being met with a slimy surface and an off smell that wasn't just the usual pungent aroma of heavily preserved protein. Grain could become clumpy and develop a musty odor. Even dried fish, if not perfectly arid, could succumb to mold in the damp air. This wasn't just an aesthetic problem. Moldy food could be unpalatable at best, and toxic at worst, causing stomach upsets or more serious illness. The crew would likely try to scrape off the worst of it, or perhaps boil the food longer in the hope of neutralizing any ill effects, but it was a constant worry. Is this blue bit on the cheese supposed to be there, Torsten, or is it just extra Viking penicillin? Then there were the rats and mice. These unwelcome passengers are notorious stowaways on ships throughout history, and Viking longships would have been no exception. They could squeeze through tiny openings, gnaw through leather bags and even wooden barrels, and get into the food stores. A family of rats could consume or contaminate a surprising amount of food in a short time. Their droppings and urine would foul the provisions, spreading disease. Hearing the telltale scratching and squeaking in the dark, knowing that your dwindling food supply was being feasted upon by vermin, would be infuriating and deeply unsettling. The historical fact is that controlling pests on wooden sailing ships before the advent of modern fumigation was incredibly difficult. While, as we speculated, a ship's cap might have helped, it's unlikely they could eliminate the problem entirely. Traps might have been set, or crew members might have engaged in rat hunts during quiet moments, but it was an uphill battle. Sometimes, the rats themselves might have ended up in the cooking pot during times of extreme starvation, a grim form of pest control meets desperate protein source. Insects were another menace. Weevils into grain and hardtack were almost a given. These tiny beetles and their larvae would burrow into the flour and biscuits, leaving behind a network of tunnels and their own frass, insect excrement. As mentioned before, sailors would often tap their biscuits to knock out the weevils, a charming dinner ritual. Maggots could infest improperly cured meat or fish. while some might stoically declare it extra protein. The sight of your food writhing with larvae would test even the strongest Viking stomach. The constant motion of the ship could also contribute to ruin. Barrels could shift and break if not properly secured, spilling their precious contents. Sacks could tear. Earthenware jars, if any were carried for special items, could shatter. Seawater washing over the deck during a storm could contaminate supplies that weren't perfectly protected, rendering them inedible or accelerating their spoilage. Imagine the despair of discovering that your last cask of fresh water has been smashed or fouled by seawater. Historians still argue about the average rate of food spoilage on Viking voyages. It would have varied enormously depending on the length of the journey, the weather conditions, the quality of the initial preservation, and the care taken in storage. However, it's safe to assume that a certain percentage of loss was expected and factored into the initial provisioning, if possible. But unexpected delays or particularly bad conditions could lead to catastrophic losses, pushing a crew towards starvation much faster than anticipated. Here's a quirky, or rather disgusting, tidbit. The bilge of a ship, the lowest internal part of the hull where water collects, would have been a horrifying soup of stagnant seawater, food scraps, vomit, and general filth. If food stores were stowed too low or improperly, and bilge water sloshed into them, the contamination would be immediate and severe. The smell alone from an unkempt bilge would be enough to curdle your skier. Keeping the bilge relatively clean, or at least ensuring food was well clear of it, was another unsung but vital task. The fight against rot, rats, and ruin was a daily one. It required vigilance, good housekeeping, as much as was possible on a cramped longship, and a certain amount of stoic acceptance that some losses were inevitable. Perhaps older, more experienced sailors developed a sixth sense for which barrel was likely to be off, or which sack was suspiciously light. They might have had traditional methods for trying to salvage slightly spoiled food, like washing it in seawater, if it wasn't already too salty, or cooking it with strong herbs, if any were available, to mask off flavors. This constant threat to their sustenance underscores the precariousness of their voyages. It wasn't just about navigating by the stars or surviving storms. It was also about outwitting the microscopic organisms and tiny creatures determined to eat their dinner before they did. Every meal consumed was a small victory in this invisible war. And every piece of food discarded due to spoilage was a tiny nail in the coffin of their hopes, a step closer to potential disaster. It really makes you appreciate modern refrigeration and Tupperware, doesn't it? We've navigated the treacherous waters of spoilage and pests, but there were other, more insidious enemies lurking within the very diet of the Viking sailor: nutritional deficiencies and the general health challenges of life at sea. While they were tough and resilient, Vikings were not immune to the debilitating effects of a limited and often monotonous diet, nor to the physical toll of long voyages. Scurvy and seasickness were just two of the unwelcome companions on their journeys. Let's start with scurvy, the scourge of seafarers for centuries. This debilitating disease is caused by a deficiency of vitamin C, a nutrient abundant in fresh fruits and vegetables but virtually absent in the typical long voyage diet of dried meats, preserved fish, and grains. The symptoms of scurvy are horrific: lethargy, muscle pain, swollen and bleeding gums, loosening teeth, reopening of old wounds, and eventually, if untreated, death. While the golden age of sail in the 17th to 19th centuries saw scurvy reach epidemic proportions on very long voyages, the historical fact is that any population deprived of fresh vitamin C for extended periods would suffer. Did Vikings get scurvy? It's highly probable, especially on their longer transatlantic voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, which could take many weeks or even months without access to fresh produce. The sagas occasionally describe symptoms that could be interpreted as scurvy, such as unexplained weakness, illness, or problems with teeth and gums among crews on long journeys. Imagine the misery. You're already enduring cramped conditions, hard labor at the oars, cold, damp, and a monotonous diet. Then, your gums start to bleed, your teeth feel loose, and every movement becomes painful. Your old battle scar from that raid in Francia starts to look inflamed and angry. It would be terrifying and deeply demoralizing. They wouldn't have understood the cause, attributing it perhaps to bad air, ill luck, or the displeasure of the gods. Did they have any empirical understanding of how to prevent or treat it, even without knowing about vitamins? It's possible. Some historians still argue whether Vikings instinctively sought out certain wild plants during coastal stops that might have contained some vitamin C, like certain berries or green leafy plants. Think of our Coastal Stop and Shop section. For example, cloudberries, found in northern regions, are rich in vitamin C. Spruce or pine needles can be used to make a tea that contains some vitamin C, a traditional remedy in some northern cultures. Whether these were consciously used to combat scurvy-like symptoms is speculative, but their resourcefulness with natural resources was well established. Perhaps they noticed that crews who managed to get some fresh greens fared better. Seasickness, or mal de mer, would have been another constant companion, especially for less experienced sailors or during particularly rough weather. The relentless motion of a longship, pitching, rolling, yawing, can play havoc with the inner ear's sense of balance, leading to nausea, dizziness, vomiting, and general misery. While seasoned Vikings probably developed their sea legs relatively quickly, bouts of seasickness could still occur. This wasn't just uncomfortable. Severe or prolonged seasickness could lead to dehydration and an inability to keep down food, further weakening an individual. There was no Dramamine in the 9th century. You just had to endure it, probably while your shipmates made unhelpful comments like, "Feeding the fishes again, Olaf? Rand will be pleased with your offering." Beyond scurvy and seasickness, other nutritional deficiencies could have arisen from the limited diet. A lack of B vitamins, found in fresh meat, some grains, and vegetables, could lead to fatigue, skin problems, and neurological issues. Insufficient dietary fiber from the lack of fresh produce could cause digestive problems. While their diet was likely high in protein from fish and meat, and they got fats from these sources and perhaps butter or skyr, the lack of variety over long periods would inevitably take its toll. Injuries and infections were also major health challenges. Life on a longship was physically demanding and hazardous. Accidents could happen: a slip on a wet deck, a misplaced axe blow during ship repairs, a burn from the cooking fire. In the absence of antibiotics and sophisticated medical care, even a relatively minor wound could become infected and life-threatening. They would have had some knowledge of basic wound care, perhaps using certain herbs with antiseptic properties, or even cobwebs, which have some clotting ability, to staunch bleeding, or cauterizing wounds with a hot iron, a truly terrifying prospect. But serious infections or broken bones would often be a death sentence, or lead to permanent disability. And what about dental health? All that hardtack, the chewy dried meat, the grit from stone-ground flour, it would have been tough on the teeth. Wear and tear, cracked teeth, and abscesses would have been common. Imagine suffering from a raging toothache in the middle of the Atlantic, with no dentist, just perhaps a shipmate willing to try and pull the offending tooth with a pair of rusty pliers. It doesn't bear thinking about. Here's a quirky, though somewhat grim, tidbit. There's some evidence from skeletal remains that Vikings, like many ancient peoples, sometimes suffered from parasites obtained from improperly cooked fish or meat, such as tapeworms. So, while they were feasting on their hard-won protein, they might have been inadvertently ingesting some rather unwelcome long-term guests. Delightful. The general hygiene on board wouldn't have helped matters. With limited fresh water, washing would be infrequent. The cramped, damp conditions would be conducive to the spread of lice and other skin ailments. Latrine facilities would be rudimentary at best, probably just a designated spot at the stern of the ship, using the overboard method. All these factors contributed to an environment where disease could easily take hold and spread among a crew already weakened by a tough diet and hard labor. So, when we envision the hardy Viking sailor, we must also acknowledge the constant battle their bodies fought against nutritional deficiencies, disease, and the sheer physical grind of life at sea. Their resilience was not just about courage in battle. It was about an incredible physiological toughness, an ability to endure conditions that would break most modern people. They were a product of a harsh environment and a demanding lifestyle, and their voyages were a testament to the limits of human endurance. both mental and physical. Every survivor who stepped ashore after a long voyage was a walking miracle of fortitude. We've painted a rather grim picture of the Viking voyage diet so far: hard, bland, salty, and often shared with weevils. It was primarily about survival, about fuel for the human engine. But were there any moments of culinary light amidst the gloom? Were any special foods packed specifically for boosting morale, for marking celebrations, or for use in rituals during those long, arduous journeys? It's an intriguing question that takes us beyond mere subsistence and into the realm of human psychology and culture at sea. While the bulk of provisions were undoubtedly practical and long-lasting, it's highly conceivable that Viking crews, especially those led by a wealthy jarl or chieftain, might have included a small stash of luxury or comfort foods. These wouldn't be everyday rations, but items brought out on special occasions or when morale was particularly low. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of a chocolate bar in a soldier's pack. A small taste of something better, a reminder of home and pleasure. What might these morale munchies have been? Honey would be a prime candidate. It was a highly prized sweetener in the Viking Age, used to make mead but also enjoyed on its own or with other foods. A small keg or pot of honey, carefully guarded, could be used to sweeten porridge, to spread on a piece of hardtack, making it slightly less of an ordeal, or even just licked from a spoon as a rare treat. The intense sweetness would be a welcome contrast to the predominantly savory and often bland fare. Dried fruits, if available through trade from sunnier climes, would also have been a luxury. Imagine dried apples, pears, or even more exotic fruits like figs or dates obtained from southern trade routes. These would provide sweetness, a different texture, and some concentrated sugars for energy. Nuts, such as hazelnuts, native to Scandinavia, or walnuts, obtainable through trade, would also be a welcome, nutrient-dense treat, providing good fats and protein along with a satisfying crunch. Look, Sven, Bjaal's broken out the dried apple rings. Either we're about to sight land, or he thinks we're all going to mutiny over the weevil count in the biscuits again. Spices, though incredibly expensive and rare in Viking Age Scandinavia, were not entirely unknown, thanks to those long-distance trade routes. A tiny pinch of pepper, ginger, or cloves, perhaps acquired from a merchant in Hedeby or Birka, could transform a bland stew. While unlikely to be common on most voyages, a chieftain might have had a small, jealously guarded spice box for his personal use or for very special occasions. The aromatic scent of a rare spice in the ship's cooking pot would be an event in itself. The historical fact is that feasting and the communal sharing of good food and drink were central to Viking social life on land. It was how bonds were forged, status displayed, and important events celebrated. It's reasonable to assume they would try to replicate these important social rituals, even in a much reduced form, at sea. Perhaps a particularly good catch of fresh fish, or the successful navigation of a dangerous passage, or a significant Norse festival, like Yule, if they were at sea during winter, might call for the breaking out of these special provisions. Historians still argue about the extent to which ritualistic food consumption occurred on voyages. Did they make specific food offerings to Thor for favorable winds, or to Ran to appease her stormy temper? The sagas contain many references to sacrifices and offerings on land, often involving the ritual slaughter of animals and the consumption of their meat and blood in a communal feast. While replicating a full-scale blot, Norse pagan sacrifice, on a longship would be difficult, smaller, symbolic offerings of food or drink, perhaps pouring some ale or mead overboard, are certainly plausible. Maybe a special piece of dried meat was set aside for Odin, hoping for wisdom in navigation. Here's a quirky tidbit: what about lucky foods? Just as sailors in later eras might have had superstitions about certain foods bringing good or bad luck, Vikings might have had their own. Perhaps a particular type of preserved berry was considered auspicious to eat before attempting a difficult landing, or a certain type of fish, if caught, was seen as a good omen. We don't have detailed records of such beliefs, but in a world governed by unpredictable forces, such small rituals around food could provide a sense of control or comfort. The sharing of these special foods, however meager, would have been incredibly important for group cohesion and morale. When the Jarl shared his personal stash of honey or mead with the crew, it wasn't just about the food itself. It was a gesture of leadership, a way of saying, "We are all in this together." It reinforced the bonds between leader and followers, and among the crew themselves. Even in the direst circumstances, a shared treat could lift spirits and renew resolve. Consider also the possibility of trophy foods. If they had a particularly successful raid before continuing their voyage, perhaps they consumed some of Dobby's prize-winning sausages, a callback to a hypothetical, much earlier, scenario involving, say, a raid on an unfortunate Anglo-Saxon pig farm. Eating the spoils of victory, even if it was just a particularly fine cheese or a cask of good wine, would be a powerful morale booster and a tangible reminder of their success. So, while the daily grind of the Viking voyage diet was undeniably tough, it's important to remember these potential moments of small culinary pleasure. They highlight the human need for more than just sustenance, for comfort, for celebration, and for connection, even in the harshest of environments. These morale munchies and ritual offerings, however infrequent, were the small sparks of warmth and humanity that helped to illuminate the long, dark, and often hungry journey across the sea. It's a reminder that even the fiercest Viking probably wouldn't say no to a biscuit, provided it wasn't a ship's biscuit. We've been relying on sagas, historical accounts, and a fair bit of educated guesswork to reconstruct the Viking voyage diet. But what if we could get more direct, tangible evidence? What if the sea itself could offer up its secrets? This is where maritime archaeology comes in, sifting through the sunken feasts, or, more accurately, the preserved remnants of food and food-related artifacts from Viking shipwrecks. These finds, though often fragmentary and challenging to interpret, can provide invaluable, concrete clues about what was actually being carried and consumed on those long journeys. Imagine the scene: archaeologists carefully excavating a preserved Viking shipwreck, perhaps one like the Skobelev ships found in Roskilde Fjord in Denmark, or the Gokstad and Oseberg ships from Norway. These vessels, sometimes deliberately sunk to block channels or interred as part of spectacular ship burials, can be time capsules, preserving organic materials that would normally decay on land. In the cold, low-oxygen environments of a seabed or a burial mound, items like wood, leather, textiles, and even food remains can survive for centuries. What kind of food-related evidence might they find? Animal bones are a common find. The bones of cattle, pigs, sheep, goats, and horses discovered within a shipwreck or a ship burial context can tell us about the types of meat being carried or consumed, either as preserved provisions or as livestock being transported. Butchery marks on these bones can even indicate how the animals were slaughtered and prepared. Fish bones, of course, are also frequently found: cod, herring, and other species, providing direct evidence of this crucial dietary staple. Sometimes, even fish scales or odorless earstones of fish can be recovered and analyzed to determine the species and even the season in which they were caught. Plant remains are more delicate but can also survive in waterlogged conditions. Archaeobotanists can identify seeds, nuts, fruit pits, and even fragments of cereal grains. Finding caches of hazelnuts, or the seeds of berries like bilberries or cloudberries, or grains of barley or rye within a shipwreck provides direct proof that these items were on board. Pollen analysis from sediment within the ship can also hint at the presence of certain plants, or even imported goods. The historical fact is that such archaeobotanical finds have confirmed the presence of a wide range of plant foods in the Viking diet, some of which were likely carried on voyages. Wooden artifacts related to food storage and preparation are also key discoveries. We've talked about barrels, and indeed, staves and hoops from barrels are often found, sometimes still bearing traces of their original contents. Wooden bowls, plates, cups, and spoons have been recovered, giving us a glimpse into the tableware used. Cornstones for grinding grain, though heavy, have also been found in association with ships, indicating onboard flour production. The remains of wooden chests that might have held personal food supplies or valuable items are also significant. Leather items, such as fragments of bags or water skins, can also survive, hinting at how liquids or dry goods were transported. And, as we mentioned, sometimes even textiles used for wrapping food or as part of clothing, which, remember our discussion on keeping warm, indirectly relates to food consumption, are preserved. Historians still argue about the interpretation of some finds. For example, if animal bones are found in a ship burial, like the lavish Oseberg burial which contained the remains of numerous horses, oxen, and dogs, does this represent typical voyage provisions, or was it part of a ritual funerary feast, or animals intended for the afterlife? Context is everything. Similarly, food remains found in a ship deliberately sunk in a harbor might reflect its last cargo or stores, but not necessarily typical long voyage provisions. Wrecks from actual open sea voyages are rarer and often more disturbed, making interpretation more challenging. Here's a quirky tidbit: sometimes, the absence of evidence can be telling. For example, if extensive remains of fishing gear, hooks, net sinkers, line weights, are found, it strongly suggests that fishing at sea was a significant activity for that particular crew. Conversely, a lack of such gear might imply a greater reliance on preserved stores for that specific voyage. However, absence of evidence isn't always evidence of absence. Such items might have been lost or simply not preserved. Occasionally, truly remarkable finds occur. In some waterlogged sites, even substances like butter or cheese, or at least the fatty acid residues indicative of them, have been identified through chemical analysis of residues in pottery or wooden containers. This is like finding a dietary fingerprint from 1,000 years ago. Imagine archaeologists carefully scraping a tiny sample from an ancient wooden keg and discovering, through gas chromatography, that it once held heavily salted butter. It's painstaking work, but incredibly rewarding. These archaeological discoveries provide a vital cross-reference to the literary sources like the sagas. While the sagas tell us stories, archaeology provides the physical objects, the tangible reality. Sometimes they confirm each other. Sometimes archaeology reveals aspects of daily life, like the specific types of pottery used for cooking, that the sagas, with their focus on heroes and battles, might not deem worthy of mention. So, when you think about what Vikings ate at sea, picture not just the literary descriptions, but also the patient work of maritime archaeologists, carefully brushing away centuries of silt to uncover a fish bone, a cherry pit, or a fragment of a wooden barrel. These sunken feasts, or rather, the humble remnants of them, are direct messages from the past, offering us concrete glimpses into the realities of life and sustenance on a Viking longship. Each artifact is a piece of a giant jigsaw puzzle, helping us to build a more complete and accurate picture of their world. It's like being a detective, but your crime scene is 1,000 years old and at the bottom of a fjord. We've dug through shipwrecks with archaeologists, considered the practicalities of preservation, and even braved the horrors of scurvy and weevils. Now, let's turn to another rich, though sometimes embellished, source of information: the Viking sagas and the poetic Eddas. What do these epic tales, these grand narratives of heroes, gods, and voyages, reveal about what Vikings ate, or aspired to eat, when they were far from the feasting halls of home? The Icelandic sagas, mostly written down in the 13th and 14th centuries but recounting events from the Viking Age, roughly 8th to 11th centuries, are a treasure trove of information about Norse society, beliefs, and daily life. While they are primarily concerned with feuds, battles, voyages of discovery, and the lives of prominent individuals, they often contain incidental details about food and provisions that can be quite revealing. You might read of a crew preparing for a voyage, and the saga writer might casually mention the loading of dried fish and flour, or casks of ale. These aren't usually the focus of the narrative, but they provide small, authenticating details. For example, in the saga of Eric the Red, which describes the Norse exploration and settlement of Greenland and Vinland, there are references to the kinds of provisions taken on these incredibly long and arduous journeys. The emphasis is often on durability, foods that could last. Sometimes food, or the lack of it, becomes a central plot point. A ship blown off course and running desperately low on supplies creates dramatic tension. The sagas might describe the hardship, the rationing, remember our discussion on that grim topic? And the immense relief when land is finally sighted and fresh food can be obtained. These accounts, even if dramatized, likely reflect very real experiences. Imagine a passage describing men weakened by hunger, their hope dwindling, only to be revived by the unexpected discovery of a flock of seabirds or a school of fish. The sagas also highlight the importance of hospitality, and food is central to that. When Viking explorers landed in a new, inhabited territory, their initial interactions often involved the exchange or sharing of food. In the Vinland sagas, there are accounts of encounters with the native inhabitants, called Skrælingr by the Norse, that involve attempts at trade, sometimes including foodstuffs. The success or failure of these interactions, and thus the ability to procure fresh supplies, could determine the viability of a new settlement. The Poetic Edda, a collection of Old Norse poems primarily from the Codex Regius manuscript, deals more with mythology and heroic legends than with the mundane details of daily diet. However, even here, food and drink play symbolic roles. Valhalla, Odin's hall for slain warriors, is depicted as a place of eternal feasting, where the warriors eat the meat of the boar Saurmir, which is cooked every day and is whole again every evening, and drink mead from the goat Ern. While this is clearly a fantastical afterlife, the emphasis on abundant meat and mead reflects what was considered desirable and high status in Viking society, and perhaps what they dreamed of when subsisting on hardtack and stockfish at sea. Oh, for a leg of Saurmir right now, instead of this thrice-boiled, suspiciously green piece of dried cod. The historical fact is that while the sagas and Eddas are literary works, not historical documents in the modern sense, they preserve cultural memory and societal norms. The foods mentioned, the attitudes towards them, the descriptions of feasting and famine, all provide valuable insights. They show us what was considered staple food, what was a luxury, and what role food played in social interactions and status. Historians still argue about the level of accuracy in the sagas concerning everyday details. Were the writers, looking back several centuries, accurately portraying the conditions of earlier Viking voyages? Or were they projecting contemporary knowledge or literary conventions onto the past? It's a complex question. However, many of the practical details, the types of preserved foods, the dangers of running out of supplies, the importance of coastal foraging, ring true with what we know from archaeology and common sense. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some sagas contain rather humorous or boastful accounts related to food or eating prowess. A hero might be famed for his ability to consume vast quantities of ale, or there might be a comical scene involving a mishap with cooking. While perhaps exaggerated for storytelling effect, these snippets can offer glimpses into attitudes towards food and social dynamics. Imagine a skald composing a verse about a hapless sailor who accidentally set his beard on fire while trying to sneak an extra piece of roasted meat from the Jarl's pot. The sagas also provide glimpses into the mental and emotional aspects of food on voyages. The longing for fresh food, the joy of a good catch, the despair of dwindling supplies, these human emotions are often vividly portrayed. They remind us that these were not just abstract logistical challenges, but deeply felt experiences that shaped the lives and fortunes of the voyagers. Consider, too, the descriptions of feasts before a voyage or after a successful return. These are often lavish affairs, emphasizing abundance, a stark contrast to the privations of the journey itself. This juxtaposition highlights the cyclical nature of their lives, periods of hardship and scarcity interspersed with times of plenty and celebration, all lubricated with copious amounts of ale and mead. So, when you delve into the sagas, look beyond the heroic deeds and epic battles. Pay attention to the quiet moments, the casual mentions of butter and bread, or the desperate search for any kind of game. These are the saga sustenance stories, the literary crumbs that, when gathered together with archaeological evidence and historical analysis, help us to piece together a more complete and more human picture of what Vikings ate on their long and often perilous journeys. They remind us that even the greatest heroes got hungry, and that the quest for a decent meal was a thread running through even the grandest of their adventures. We've journeyed far, haven't we? From the initial, daunting task of packing the longship's larder, through the monotonous munching of hardtack and the chewy challenge of stockfish, past the surprising tang of skyr and the desperate hopes of a fishing line dropped into the vast ocean. We've considered the crucial role of women, the dangers of rot and rats, the agony of scurvy, and even sifted through sunken shipwrecks and ancient sagas for clues. Now, as we draw near to the end of our own voyage tonight, it's time to bring it all together. Feast or famine? What was the actual reality of the Viking diet at sea, and how can we dispel some of the more persistent myths? The overarching truth is that the Viking voyage diet was, above all, pragmatic and rooted in survival. It was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a gourmet experience. The primary goal was to get enough calories and basic nutrients into the crew to keep them functioning, rowing, sailing, fighting, exploring, for weeks or months on end, often in incredibly harsh conditions. Myth number 1 to dispel: Vikings feasted like kings every day on their ships. While sagas and popular culture often depict lavish banquets with roasted meats and overflowing horns of mead, this was the reality of the longhouse on land, and even then, likely for the wealthier echelons of society, or on special occasions. At sea, especially on long-haul voyages, such abundance was a fantasy. The daily fare was far more likely to be a monotonous rotation of preserved, often bland, and sometimes unappetizing staples. Remember the hardtack that could double as a weapon, or the stockfish needing a good beating before it was even remotely chewable. That was the norm, not the exception. Myth number 2: Vikings had an endless supply of fresh meat from livestock carried on board. While they certainly transported livestock, particularly on colonization voyages, think of those precious breeding pairs of cattle, sheep, and pigs heading to Iceland or Greenland, these animals were not primarily intended as a floating buffet for the crew. They were the foundation of future herds in new lands. They would only be slaughtered at sea in dire emergencies, or perhaps if an animal was injured and unlikely to survive the journey. The bulk of meat consumed at sea was the preserved kind, dried, salted, smoked, prepared long before departure. The historical fact, supported by both archaeology and common sense, is that the Viking diet at sea was heavily reliant on a few key categories of preserved foods. Carbohydrates, primarily from grains like barley and oats, consumed as porridge/gruel or as incredibly durable hardtack/ship's biscuit. Protein, preserved dominated by dried and or salted fish, especially stockfish from cod, and to a lesser extent, dried/salted/smoked meat from domestic animals like cattle, sheep, and pigs. Dairy, preserved hard cheeses and concentrated, fermented products like skyr, providing valuable fats and proteins. Liquids, fresh water, carefully rationed, supplemented by low-alcohol ale, safer than stored water and more nutritious, and perhaps some mead for special occasions or higher-status individuals. Supplementing these core provisions were the opportunistic additions: fresh fish caught at sea, shellfish and edible plants gathered during coastal stops, and occasionally, food acquired through trade. These would have been welcome breaks in the monotony and crucial sources of fresh nutrients, but they were not guaranteed. Historians still argue about the precise balance of these components, and how much variation there was depending on the type of voyage, raiding versus trading versus exploration, the season, the wealth of the expedition's leader, and the geographical region. A short coastal raid in summer might have allowed for more fresh food than a multi-month winter crossing of the North Atlantic. Here's a final quirky tidbit for our journey. It's been suggested that some Vikings might have consumed small amounts of dirt or clay, either deliberately, geophagy, practiced in some cultures for minerals or to settle stomachs, or inadvertently with poorly cleaned root vegetables. While this is highly speculative for Vikings, it underscores the often unpalatable realities and desperate measures that could be associated with ancient diets in extreme situations. Probably not a recommended dietary supplement today. So, was it feast or famine? The honest answer is, it was often a delicate balance, a constant race against depletion and spoilage, with the very real possibility of famine looming if a voyage went wrong. There were undoubtedly periods of relative plenty, perhaps after a successful raid or a good foraging opportunity. But these would have been interspersed with long stretches of monotonous, barely adequate rations, and sometimes, true hardship and hunger. The true feast for a Viking on a long voyage was likely not a specific dish, but the simple fact of having enough. Enough to quell the gnawing hunger, enough to provide strength for the oars, enough to keep hope alive until land was sighted. Their diet was a testament to their incredible resilience, their ingenuity in food preservation, and their profound understanding of the harsh environments they navigated. They didn't just conquer seas and lands, they conquered, to a remarkable degree, the fundamental challenge of feeding themselves far from home, paving the way for one of history's most extraordinary periods of expansion and exploration. Their voyage diet wasn't pretty, but it fueled an age. And as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can appreciate the contents of your own fridge a little more, knowing that you don't have to beat your dinner with a mallet or pick weevils out of your breakfast. The echoes of those Viking voyages, the creak of the longship, the taste of salt and dried fish, can fade now. The long watch is over. The larder for tonight is full. The journey has been long, much like one of those Norse expeditions across the vast, unknowable ocean. We've peered into the dim holds of longships, tasted the grit of hardtack in our imaginations, and felt the chill of the North Atlantic spray. We've shared in the small triumphs of a fresh catch and the quiet anxieties of dwindling supplies. The world of Viking seafaring sustenance, with its stark realities and ingenious solutions, has, I hope, unfolded before you, not as a dry list of provisions, but as a human story of endurance, resourcefulness, and the eternal, unyielding quest for survival against the odds. Think of those sailors, huddled against the elements, their world reduced to the rocking deck beneath their feet and the endless horizon. Their food was more than mere fuel. It was a connection to the homes they had left behind, a source of meager comfort in an unforgiving environment, and the very bedrock of their audacious ambitions. Every preserved fish, every hard biscuit, every carefully hoarded drop of ale was a testament to their will to venture forth, to discover, to conquer, and to return. Now, let the sounds of the waves recede, let the scent of wood smoke and salt air dissipate. The oars are stilled, the sails furled. The only journey left for you tonight is the gentle one into slumber. May your dreams be free of weevils and stormy seas. May you find rest and peace, knowing that even in the harshest of times, humanity finds a way, not just to endure, but to reach for the stars, or in the Vikings' case, for the next horizon. Sleep now. Sleep deeply.